Okay, we are now live.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the San Ramon Valley Unified School District Board of Education workshop. We want to let the public know that we are video recording today's workshop. The recording is being live streamed on the district's YouTube channel, and a link to the recording has been posted to the district's website. I'd like to introduce my board members. So Vice President Ken Mintz, you wave, thank you. Our clerk, Rachel Hurd, and board members, Laura Bratt.
Hi.
And Shelley Clark. And I am Susanna Ordway, President of the board. If right now you'd like to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, that would be great. Okay. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And then may I have a motion to accept today's agenda for our workshop?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, I wasn't quite sure who moved, but I'm going to, because I see the little green, like who spoke, was around Laura. I'm going to say the motion was made by Laura and seconded by Rachel. Okay, so I'm going to do the roll call vote. So board member Clark.
Aye.
Board member Bratt.
Yes.
Board member Hurd.
Aye.
Board member Mintz.
Aye.
And I voted aye, so motion passes 5-0. Okay. Right now, I'd like to introduce our attorney, Harold Freeman from Lorenzo Smith, who will present our board governance workshop today. Harold, thank you for coming back.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming back. You're the ones who have to sit through more time with the lawyer, so you have the more challenging part today. And as with last time, we are going to put up the PowerPoint to sort of help walk us through things. So just as a reminder to folks, when that's up, I won't necessarily see you unless you're talking. So feel free to, raise your hand, ask questions, jump in. We talked last time at some length about the Brown Act, and we also talked about board member responsibilities. And one of the things that we talked about then was board member liability issues, which is one of the things I noted it's exciting for me to present on, just because most school boards don't get training on that very important subject. Today, we're going to cover 3 topics. We're going to go through the conduct of board meetings. We're going to chat about the Public Records Act, and we're going to finish up on ethics in public service. On this first point, the conduct of board meetings, this is one of those topics where board members don't get a lot of time to discuss this and have training on it. This is a great topic, and one that I think we'll probably spend a lot of our time on today, talking through what actually is it that happens at board meetings, addressing just the technical issues, what does your board policies have to say, et cetera, but also talking about just in practice, what happens at board meetings, especially these days, since they're all done virtually. How do you navigate your way through? Because there's some extra challenges that are built in when you're doing things electronically. So that's what we're going to spend a chunk of our time on. This is a topic, definitely, I would encourage you all, ask questions, weigh in, share thoughts with each other, because in speaking to the superintendent, one of the objectives is to help get you versed on what your current rules are, but it's also to get you thinking about what you might want your rules to be. Are there other procedures and practices that you might want to have in effect? My experience with a lot of school boards, they range the gamut from being very informal in the way they run board meetings, very conversational, to being extremely formal. And a lot of that has to do with history and what's happened in the district before. San Ramon Valley is probably somewhere about in the middle of that. You are somewhat formal, but not as formal as some. And one of the things we'll talk about today is where there's room potentially to tighten up some practices, or at least talk about maybe slightly different ways of approaching things to help you, especially again during the challenge of COVID and virtual meetings. So with that, Logan, if we can go to the next slide. The first thing I wanted to start talking about is the actual agenda. So one of the things that we don't spend a lot of time talking about is where the heck do these agendas come from? How are they put together? How do they evolve? So I want to sort of walk you through some of the points on that to sort of help you understand where your agendas come from. And again, this is an opportunity if you've got questions for one another, for the superintendent about process on any of that, feel free to weigh in. There's 3 bullet points here I want to walk you through. First one is the public request for packet. This really builds off of our Brown Act discussion, because under the Brown Act, if a member of the public makes a request for agendas for your board packet that goes with the agenda, they're entitled to it. And the basic rule under the Brown Act is they're entitled to it at the same time the board gets it. No sooner, no later. They basically get it at the same time as the rest of the board getting it. But there's also an interesting issue that's unique to school districts that other public agencies don't have to worry about. It's not in the Brown Act, it's in the Education Code, that the public can actually make requests for agenda items. The public can ask to have agenda items put on. And I'll talk to you in a moment about what your board policy says about that. That's a kind of tricky one, right? Because we always have to add the qualifier within reason. The request has to be something that is within the jurisdiction of the district. And I want to tell you a little story about it. I think I've told you before, for every court case, there's a story behind the court case. And there was a really interesting one on this question of the public asking for agenda items that came out of San Jose Unified School District. So not terribly far away. This is the Mooney case. And what happened in the Mooney case, it's really an interesting one, was that there was an event that took place at a school that was basically a diversity day. They flew the rainbow flag. It was talking about diversity. It was very oriented, I believe, around LGBTQ awareness issues. And there were some folks who took offense to that topic. So they wanted the board to address not doing this again in the future. And the school district took the position that the question of whether or not to hold a diversity day at a particular school site, that was not something the board imposed. That was something the school site did. And it was not within the board's jurisdiction to tell them one way or the other to do it. And so they refused to add the agenda item. The aggrieved people who wanted the agenda item sued, and the courts upheld the notion that it truly has to be within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. So when people ask for agenda items, it can't just be anything under the sun. It has to be truly something that the board has authority over or has acted over. And we'll come back to that concept as we look at your board policy. And then, by the way, it has to be, by statutory language, it's supposed to be directly related to school business as well. And I'm emphasizing this point because we're going to come back to this when we get back to the public comment discussion about what does it mean to be directly related to school district business. It's not always the most obvious thing to work your way through in the middle of a board meeting. So we'll talk about here how that applies. And then there's also board requests for agenda items when board members would like agenda items added. So if we can go to the next slide, it talks you through your policy how this is all going to work. And I'll let you read the words there for yourself, but the bottom line is it emphasizes again that as a board member or a member of the public can ask that an item get on an agenda if it's within the jurisdiction of the board to be placed on the agenda of a regular meeting. Now that's an interesting thing. Your district has decided to have a board policy that specifically says when members of the public request, it's a request for a regular meeting, not a special meeting. That's not necessarily something that every district has in their policies. It's also interesting because your policies talk about when you're supposed to get these requests in. It's supposed to be in by 4:30 p.m. Monday of the week preceding the scheduled meeting date. And if it's less than a week, it's going to get postponed to a later meeting. So this is what your policy says. And now I'm going to editorialize and tell you what I don't like about your policy. Because this is a policy that I think is based on a model that's out there. It's based on the CSBA model. A lot of districts have it. Legally, the school board, when a member of the public asks an item to be added to an agenda, completely up to you legally whether you do it the next meeting, the meeting after, 3 meetings down the road, whether or not you do it at a regular meeting, you do it at a special meeting, whether it's going to be an open session item or a closed session item. Those are all within your discretion. But based on your board policy, it suggests that if somebody gets something in by 4:30 p.m. on a Monday, you are going to put it on your next agenda at least a week out. And sometimes these items can be burdensome. They can really take up a lot of staff time. They need to get looked at. They need to be addressed. So this is fine for maybe the member of the public who just wants to have their moment to stand up and speak on an agenda item that they've added. But if, for example, a board member wants a study session on something and requests that under this policy, it would have to be at a regular meeting and they'd have to get it in within this timing. So there's a few times today I'm going to sort of pause on some of your board bylaws that have probably existed as they exist for a very long time to plant the seed that there are things that you might want to look at again. There's nothing wrong with this board policy. It complies with all of the applicable law. It just removes some of the board's discretion over the control of its own agenda. And at the end of the day, it is the district's agenda. It's your business meeting. We talked about that at our last gathering to get through. So before I go on, are there any questions or do anybody want to pause to chat about this particular policy?
So Harold, I have a question. So, okay. And it's funny to me, it's kind of like the board, you know, chicken and the egg and different things surrounding this. So let's say we discussed, and do we have to discuss this? If we do make changes, do we make changes at a regular meeting? You know, like agendize, just not even a topic, but a changing of board bylaw or adding, or how does that work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So if you're going to amend a board bylaw or even just to discuss whether you want to amend it, today is not the time because it's not on the agenda. We can surface this. We can see if there's an interest in the future in addressing it. But you would do it at an agendized board meeting. The board does have to take action whenever it amends its bylaws. It's a little bit different for your administrative regulations. Some districts have the board approve administrative regulations that basically are detail on how to carry out a board bylaw. Some don't, because they can be administratively, you know, through the superintendent and staff administered. But for an actual board bylaw, you would have to come back at a future meeting. We'll also talk more about this as we go today. You know, the district has not spent a lot of time, as I understand it, revisiting its board bylaws. There are school districts out there, aplenty, that have process to do this, where either they will, on a regular basis, review all their policies, which is really quite overwhelming. That's for some of the biggest districts that have a lot of the staff to do that. Or sometimes it's just a matter of making sure you're doing an update. CSBA comes out annually with their updated policies. And I was going to talk about this later, but your question actually opens the door to it. There are policies that you are required by law to have, and they have to be current in a host of different areas, student discipline matters and Title IX and just a host of different areas where every time the law changes, CSBA will put out a new model policy and you're supposed to revisit that policy. You don't have to necessarily update it to match CSBA's, but you're supposed to give it thought. So what some school districts also do is have a subcommittee of the board or even a staff committee that basically goes through all of this and figures out what should come back to the board, what's their interest in coming back, because there's, you know, hundreds of board policies. It's really hard to tackle them all at the same time. So that's a long way of answering the question that this is something that I was actually hoping we'd get to today to think about. What process does the board want to go through to revisit? It may be this board bylaw looks great to everybody and there's no interest in revisiting it. Since I editorialized, maybe there's some interest in at least looking at it and asking both, does it truly reflect what your practice is now? And does it reflect what you want your practice to be? Is it fair to staff to tell them that any board member or member of the public can require an item to be added to an agenda that may be just a week out? a week and a day out, if you will. That's a lot of burden on staff. And a lot of times these old board bylaws came from times when school districts were smaller and things were done a little bit more informally. And as districts get bigger and the law, the education code never gets shorter, it only gets longer. As that happens, to maybe tighten up the practice. So nothing you have to decide today, but I think it's a good thing to be thinking about.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Harold, this is Ken. Yeah, just to clarify, a few years ago, we did in fact go through all the policies and utilize CSBA, which we had not done directly in the past. And for the most part, we just adopted a lot of CSBA policies, making some changes for local differences. So yeah, this is one that I believe we haven't necessarily been focused on that 4:30 the Monday before. And in fact, it gets to my question, which you might be covering later, but when a member of the public requests something to be put on the board agenda, a matter before the board, that does not mean that member of the public is going to be able to be given time to give a presentation and make their presentation to the board, other than commenting on whatever agenda item is before the board as either discussion or action item. And that's where, yes, when you look at this, I'd want to see something different, because usually when something does come from the public or even a member of the board, it's turned back to staff to do an investigation of the topic and maybe require, like you say, a lot of work that needs to be done before it can be brought back even for discussion by the board. So I guess my question is maybe just confirming that if the public brings something forward, that does not mean that the public now has control over an agenda item. It just means that we as a board are bringing something forward on the agenda. They have regular rights to comment, but that's as far as it necessarily goes.
Yeah, Ken, you're absolutely right. The board meeting remains the meeting of the board. And simply because something was added to the agenda doesn't mean that somebody suddenly has the right to step into the role of staff. You still have your staff, you still have your elected board, you still control your meeting. It's certainly within the district's discretion if you wanted to allow somebody to do a presentation.
Sure.
And I'll illustrate that. There's another district here in the Bay Area that a group of parents, a large group of parents, wanted to have an item added to an agenda and really wanted to have extra time because it was going to be hard for them to really do their thing. And so what the district ultimately worked out with them was they gave them a 10-minute slot for them to split up however they wanted this large number of people to present one presentation to the board. And they actually put up their PowerPoint. Now that was a situation where you probably had 100, 200 parents who wanted to address this. This wasn't, a small issue. And the board decided to accommodate it. It didn't have to. And in fact, there was some legal wrangling about they were unhappy with even the 10 minutes, but in the end, it worked out. Ultimately, you could put this on a regular agenda and the person who asked it to be on gets the same 3 minutes they usually get at any other board meeting. So you can kind of take it on a case-by-case basis, but it is a consistent theme throughout everything we talk about today. Ultimately, this is a business meeting of the school district, of the board. And just because somebody added something to the agenda, just because they're particularly interested in an issue, doesn't necessarily mean that they get extra time. We actually dealt with this, if you'll recall, when the district made its transition to by-trustee area elections, because there was an attorney who had made a demand on the district to make that change, and he felt that he should have basically additional time to other members of the public to be able to address his points. And ultimately, the district decided, no, he was a member of the public, and he could speak during the public comment period the way that everybody else could. Any other questions about this bylaw before we go? We're going to actually talk about another piece of the same bylaw in just a moment, but anything else on this one? Okay, so why don't we go to the next slide? So this board bylaw also talks about mechanics. It gets into this sort of mechanical process. your district, like most under this bylaw, it's the board president and the superintendent who decide whether or not a request that a member of the public made, and I'd even go further and say a request that a member of the board made, is truly within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. And if they decide that it's not, it doesn't get placed on the board. That's laid out in your board bylaw. The other thing that this gives the authority to the board president and the superintendent to do is to determine, is this really just a request for information? Is it something we've already addressed? Is it something that's already covered by an existing policy? So for example, a member of the public asked to have an item added to the agenda that the board consider a policy to do X, whatever X is. And the superintendent and the board president determined we already have a policy that does X. This bylaw basically indicates you can go back to the person who requested it and tell them we've already got such a policy. Now, if they're asking you to revisit or reopen that policy, that's different. But if they're asking you to adopt something that you've already adopted, you don't have to do that. And then the request for information, sometimes members of the public just want information. And you have this awkward moment where they want to get up at a board meeting and ask the board questions. And they can't do so unless the item is on the agenda. You can't have that general conversation during a meeting. So sometimes this is just an attempt to elicit information. And if the board president and superintendent determine that the request really is just a request for information and they have information to provide, they don't necessarily have to agendize the item. They're able to give the information. So this part of Board Bylaw 9322, I think, is great. It allows for efficiency. It allows you to retain control over your meeting, even while you're entertaining requests from the public. So when I talk about revisiting this bylaw potentially, you have to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff and decide what part you want to look at. And if we can go to the next slide to finish off on Board Bylaw 9322, the board president and the superintendent decide whether it's going to be an open session or a closed session item. That's a really important one because somebody may ask for, we want a discussion of a particular employee in the district. Well, that's probably going to be a closed session discussion, which is always a sort of awkward thing to roll your way through in order to comply with the education code and your board bylaw. Yes, you'll add it to the agenda, but you're not going to have the discussion in open session with the board. It's a confidential matter. It's attorney-client privileged. It falls within one of the exceptions of the Brown Act that we discussed last time. And then you'll also note that if it's an item that doesn't appear to need immediate attention, there does seem this part of the bylaw to give some discretion as to whether or not it's going to be voted on, or if it's just going to be a discussion item on the agenda, or maybe even just a consent item for which no discussion is anticipated. I can really not think of an example where you put something that somebody requested from the public on a consent calendar, but perhaps it exists. I just haven't come across it yet. So that's mechanically what your board bylaws say about how things get on the agenda, whether they're from a board member, whether they're from a member of the public. Any questions about that before we go on to the next part? Okay, well, let's keep moving then to the next slide. This is an interesting one, which is that under the Brown Act, you're supposed to describe your agenda items in a clear and an unambiguous manner. This is something that disputes come up about. There's a lot of cases that litigated the question about whether an agenda was clear enough or not. And I know that the district has also had recent experience with some of this question getting raised by members of your public. The challenge you have is that the government code says that you're supposed to make this clear and unambiguous. It also says in general, you're not supposed to have an agenda item that's longer than 20 words. So the general rule is less than 20 words, but be clear and unambiguous. Well, that's tough, right? Those are almost mutually contradictory statements, which is why sometimes the additional detail that's there is in your board agenda backup. It's, the staff memo or the backup that you're provided with it. So there may be a general topic set out in your agenda, and then the specifics of what's going to be discussed under it are in that backup that you can get. And it makes it clear to the public as a whole. When this issue came up recently in the district, there was a question that was raised about if an agenda item was adequately clear. And it seemed like it was adequately clear when you took into account what was in the backup as well and read them together. So with the agenda, you've always got to sort of walk this narrow line of you need to be clear and unambiguous to the extent you can, but you need to be succinct as well. And what the cases talk about that's really helpful is that the agenda item is supposed to be enough to put people on fair notice as to what's going to be discussed and what the essential nature of what's going to be discussed is. So they're on reasonable, fair notice, and that they are able to tell the essential nature of what you're going to talk about. Does that mean it's every nuance of the issue? No, it's not. It's a general description. And one way of looking at that is, do you have enough out there that if somebody was interested in the topic, they would have known to come to the board meeting? That's really fundamentally the question on that. I think we lost our PowerPoint, but it's nice to see all of your faces. Any questions on that concept, this clear and unambiguous, but also succinct agenda?
Harold, just one quick comment. Generally, our practice is the week before, the superintendent meets with the board president and one other board member to review the agenda for the next week. And it's usually, if not always, staff's responsibility to put the agenda together. And during that review is the time that board members would, identify if there was some clarity from our perspective in question. But it's usually a staff function in terms of the agenda. Do you find that's the case in most districts as opposed to board members actually putting things on the agenda or the wording of things on the agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very staff driven. I can probably think of 3 or 4 times over the last 3 decades that I've seen a board member actually prepare the item. And that's usually done in conjunction with staff because it may be something the board member is passionate about or a topic that they raised, but it almost always runs through staff. That moment where you have the board president and one other member reviewing the agenda with staff or going over items is a great chance for you to weigh in and really give thought to, is the wording of this going to let people know what it is we're going to talk about? Is there enough here? Is there too much here? So it's a great check and balance process, really, to make sure, because one of the hardest things to do for a staff member is when you're preparing the agenda item, you already know what you're going to say, right? You have it in mind. You know what it is you're getting at. When you know what you're already going to say, sometimes it's the hardest to say it in a way that clearly communicates to others what's coming. And so it's a great opportunity if board members have a question. I'm not sure what this means. I'm not sure if this, points people in the right direction. I also have to give the caveat that I gave you last time we met, which is you are not required to be perfect. The Brown Act does not require absolute perfect compliance with the Brown Act. It requires substantial compliance. And so, you can get hung up on this wording too and go a little bit crazy. And as I discussed with you last time with the Brown Act, sometimes when people don't like something you've done, they will start picking on issues like, what was the wording of the agenda? And so I always have to reiterate, it's not perfection. It's just, would a reasonable person reading the agenda have expected what was discussed to be discussed and be enough put on notice that they would have come to the board meeting if it was of interest to them? Or now I guess I can say watch the board meeting.
Yeah, the other thing that meeting allows is to identify if something is just discussion, and if it's an action item, should it be, its own item, or is it okay for it to be consent? And so that's something we talk about in those meetings quite a bit as well, just in terms of, making sure we have the right information going out to the public, in a more visible way. And other times, if it's routine, maybe we don't have to spend as much time on it unless someone were to choose to pull it off of the consent.
Right. And that structuring of the agenda is a really critical moment, because how your board meeting goes is going to be very much dictated by how the agenda was structured. There's a great quote that I don't have handy, but it's out of an article from Chicago on the Illinois School Boards Association. And out of the Chicago School District, obviously very large school district, the 3rd largest in the country, they could have meetings that go forever. And one of their board members has this great statement about when their meetings go late, is it because they had a lot to cover, or is it because they did not efficiently agendize the meeting? And you really have to think about that. Are you, if you put on 10 critical study sessions in one night, you're going to be there till 2 in the morning. And this goes back to, by the way, the point I made earlier on board policy or board bylaw 9322. If you have to always add everything at the next available meeting, you don't get to slot out which meetings things will be considered, and it can really gum up a particular meeting. So this pre-agenda moment is a critical moment. And I'd also say it's also a moment when the agenda goes out. It's never too late. If a board member has a question, I didn't understand how this was agendized, I'm not sure it was done correctly, whatever it is, call the superintendent, reach out and ask the question, because it's better to surface that now than have it surface at the meeting. Because there are times that there are various ways that you can potentially cure if there really is a problem, or sometimes it's not a problem and you just need the superintendent to answer your question. And the superintendent's able to explain why it's not a problem, so you don't have to at the board meeting then come out and say you think there's a problem. So it's good to communicate in advance with staff on that, definitely. Well, I'm going to keep going with or without the PowerPoint. Hopefully, I think Logan had it going. Hopefully we'll see Logan back. I think I talked to you last time about typically most of the board meetings I go to. Oh, Danny's here.
I was just gonna let the group know. I can speak to the people at the Education Center through phones. It sounds like the internet is down at that location and several others, and they're looking into it. In the meantime, we'll try to get the PowerPoint back up, but keep going.
Danny, I just gave you host controls.
Great. Well, I was just about to say, this is part of the fun of having board meetings during COVID with all of the technology. It's great when it works, but it almost never works. So we roll with the punches. So with that thought in mind, I'm going to keep going if it's okay with you, and I'll let you know what the PowerPoint has to say, and you'll all get a copy of it. So that should work. So the next thing we're going to talk about, actually, can you set the stage for this, is the consent calendar. What goes on the consent calendar and how does it get on there? And your board bylaw, it's the same board bylaw, 9322. So if you have one bylaw you want to read about all of this, that's the one. Talks about that the consent calendar is for items of a routine nature. And it sort of discusses the fact, and the concept there is that you don't anticipate board discussion, and the superintendent, the staff, support the item. So this is coming to you with staff recommendation, typically for action on a consent calendar. There's likely not to be discussion. The classical example is you have a contract that renews annually for a service that is not controversial with a vendor that you're happy with. That might be well suited for the consent calendar. One of the things that we struggle with in some school districts is there are board members who like to discuss lots of things. And so they'll pull items from the consent calendar, as you're typically allowed to do. Really, if you have a lot of these things being pulled, it should be a warning sign, either that staff is not guessing and the board president is not guessing correctly what might not be controversial to include, or alternatively, that board members may want to be discussing things that are not necessarily of great controversy or of great moment, if you will, which can definitely make for longer board meetings. So the consent calendar is another place where you structure the meeting, where you really got to think carefully about how you put it together. One of the rules, as always under the Brown Act, is if you're going to take action on anything, including a consent calendar, you have to allow for public comment. And I know that there was a question that came out of a recent board meeting on this. Yes, the public is allowed to comment on public comment items or on consent calendar items. It's pretty simple when you're dealing with a live board meeting where somebody submits a speaker card. You know that somebody wants to speak on one of those items, and so that item will get pulled and commented on. When you're doing it in this format, it's really hard because you're not looking necessarily at the audience. And so the lesson learned really is, when you get to consent calendar, invite if there's any public comment, invite if any board member wants to remove any of the items for discussion. I always have a rule that I learned through public speaking a million years ago, is if you ask a question, always wait 10 to 15 seconds to see if you get an answer. So when you say, is there any public comment, give it the extra time. I will just say, I watched the video of your recent board meeting where this question had come up, and I did not see any significant problem with that board meeting. But you can always make things clearer. So whenever you're going to take action on anything, have that moment of pause. Is there any public comment? Would any board member like to pull the item? And if the item gets pulled, it gets discussed, and it gets voted on separately. That's okay under the Brown Act because it was on the agenda to start with. So members of the public are alerted that it's there. So that's just a word or two on consent calendar. Were there any questions about consent?
Sure, Harold, I'll ask a question.
Sure.
At a recent local city council meeting, someone was asking to pull everything off of the consent calendar. Can you talk a little bit about the public's rights? You know, in our preamble to consent, we ask if there's anything that the board member, staff, or public would like to pull. But if someone is looking to disrupt a meeting and ask to pull everything and make everything a standalone action item, what kind of response would you look to say is appropriate?
Yeah, you know, it's a tricky thing because, again, the Brown Act says you're supposed to allow public comment on anything on the agenda before action is taken on it. So one way that districts have dealt with this, and I think it's a compliant under the Brown Act way of doing it, if you really start having a problem with that, is you say, okay, all of these items can now be discussed. We're going to have one public comment period for all of the items that were pulled. So if there were 10 items on the consent calendar that were pulled, a member of the public who pulled each one of them does not get 30 minutes, they get 3 minutes. And the other members of the public get 3 minutes. The reason that that's allowable is that you have to allow public comment before you take action, but the Brown Act allows you to control with reasonable regulation how much time will be afforded to that public comment. So you can treat it accordingly. So if that became, you know, a problem, I would think that would be a way to do it, that the person would still have been given their right to comment on the items. That you arguably under the Brown Act, you actually, and I've seen districts try this and I don't recommend it, you could just have one public comment period for every item on the agenda at the outset of your meeting, because the Brown Act says you have to allow for public comment before or during the discussion of the item. That starts to really make it so that it's hard for anybody to address anything. But if you're truly putting non-controversial things on the consent calendar, if they're basic contracts and whatnot, allowing somebody 3 minutes to comment on all of them should be sufficient. I don't think that's an unreasonable regulation. So that would be where I would tend to go with that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Well, I'd say go on to the next slide, but we don't have slides, so I'm going to turn my page and go on to the next one, talking about the agenda. And here I just wanted to point out that you know, the general rule of the Brown Act is that every item that you're going to be taking action on or discussing has to appear on the agenda. That's a straightforward Brown Act requirement. But there are some exceptions, and I wanted to talk you through 4 of these exceptions. It's really helpful for all 5 board members as well as staff to be familiar with these. They don't come up a lot, but a lot of times they're a way of saving the situation if you didn't agendize something quite the way that it was supposed to be agendized, or something didn't make it to the agenda on time. So those 4 are, the first one is emergency situations. This is very, very rare. This is where there's a threat to public safety or public health. You can actually have a board meeting called on 1 hour notice to the media, and you don't even post an agenda, you just meet. I may have mentioned this at the last time when we spoke. I've only done this twice in 27 years. Once was when there had been flooding and it was unclear if schools would be able to open the next day, and it was critical to get board input on what they were going to try to do, or if they were going to decide schools were closed. The superintendent had the authority to close the schools, but they really wanted to get the board's input on that, and they had an emergency meeting. And the other one was where a building had burned down, literally on a Sunday night. So they had to figure out where to put the kids on Monday. And again, superintendent probably had the authority within their discretion to act on that, but wanted to get the board's input because there were some tough questions there. So a lot of times I get questions about, oh, we forgot to put something on the agenda and it's an emergency. Can we add it? You know, emergency means emergency. It means people or property are threatened. But there are other ways to add items to the agenda that didn't make it that I want to share with you. So the second exception is the subsequent need item under the Brown Act. So the Brown Act has an interesting provision in it that says that if something arises after you post your agenda, And arises really means comes to the district's attention for the first time. After the agenda is posted, you can actually add the item to the agenda at the meeting with a 2/3 vote of your board. And this does come up from time to time. The example I always use, because this actually happened to a district, was they had moved district offices. And there was a very important piece of mail from the federal government about a grant that went to the wrong address and took a very long time to work its way to the right address. So they posted their 72-hour regular meeting agenda about, I don't know, 10 hours before the meeting. They get this piece of mail that they open for the first time that says they have to take board action by a certain date. And that certain date, I think, was the next day. And they had the board meeting happening that day. That was a situation in which they had to take immediate action. It came to their attention after the agenda was posted, and immediate action was actually needed. That's the other piece of it. You have to actually have a reason for doing it. So that's another exception that we do actually see come up from time to time. There's an alternative to that exception, which is if you find out 24 hours in advance. So if you're within 24 hours, that's your only cure. But if you find out about it more than 24 hours in advance, for example, we just forgot to agendize something, you can also add a special board meeting to occur the same night as your regular board meeting. And I know we've done that with you before, where you just have a one-item special meeting to happen right before the regular meeting. So there's always that opportunity as well. You don't want to make a habit of that, but if it's something that you need to do from time to time, districts do it. A couple other exceptions that come up. One of them is something that most people don't know, which is you can have a held over item. So you can have a posted agenda and be meeting and not finish the item. You can actually continue that item to another meeting anytime within the next 5 days without having to repost your agenda, without having to have a new agenda item. You can just continue it. So for example, we had a special meeting for a school district that was taking comment on a particular project that was very controversial. And that comment went to midnight. The board decided they did not want to try to keep meeting that night. So they continued the meeting to the next day without reposting the agenda and just picked up where they left off. One important nuance to that is if you've already spoken on that item, you don't get to speak again just because it got carried over to the next day. You get one shot at the item as a member of the public. Oh, we have our agenda or a PowerPoint back. Yay. We're on page 70, Logan, or on slide 70, excuse me. Thank you. Nice to have you back. So let's actually go forward a couple more slides. Let's see. One more. There we go. We caught up. Thank you. So then the last one I was going to mention is announcements and responding to public comments and questions. I'm going to get into that in more detail further below, but it's an interesting exception to the Brown Act. If you don't have something agendized and somebody speaks during general public comment at a regular meeting, you are allowed within limits to respond, but they're very limited in how you can do that. And I'll talk you through in just a few moments exactly what those limits are. One of the things that also happens in this exception when somebody speaks, it's important to recognize, and we talked about this last time, big difference between regular board meetings and special board meetings. Regular board meetings, people can make comments on anything within your jurisdiction. Special board meetings, they can only discuss that which is on the agenda. And it is a big difference between the two different types of meetings. Members of the public won't always understand that. So they'll question, why am I not getting an opportunity to speak on whether we should have a crossing guard at a particular location? If it's a special meeting, the answer is because it's a special meeting. It's just the way that the Brown Act is structured. So Logan, if we can go to the next slide. And again, I promise you we'll come back to the discussion of what happens at the board meeting when there is public comment, how you can respond. One of the things I want to touch on is inspection of documents. This has always been a question that comes up with school boards, and it's been even trickier now that we're doing things virtually. So the rules basically are this. If there is a writing that is distributed to the board before a meeting in relation to an agenda item that is a non-confidential item, obviously it's not a closed session report about an employee or advice from your attorney, So if you have, for example, a PowerPoint presentation that's distributed to the board on a regular open session, common meeting item, you are going to make that available to the public at the same time. It's pretty easy because it's usually going to be part of your board packet at that point in time. But you see in the second bullet, sometimes the PowerPoint's not ready by the time the agenda is posted. Staff has a lot to do. Maybe that PowerPoint isn't ready until the day before. If it's distributed to the board at that time, it has to be distributed to the public at that time. So it's always that same rule. The public and the board get the same materials in relation to an agenda item. If it's not related to anything that's on an agenda, you don't have to provide it to the public at the same time you provide it to the board. Then you've also got writings that are distributed by staff or by board members, even at a board meeting. The general rule for that is if it's distributed at the meeting, it's got to be made publicly available at the meeting. So if you're having a live board meeting, that's easy, right? You have the staff pass out the copies of whatever it is that they're going to be looking at, and they put a stack of copies in the back of the room. But virtually, it gets to be really difficult. And we don't have an easy answer for you on what to do. What we did with one district recently was we just came up with a rule that if something was distributed at the meeting, it would literally be, if it was something that had to get scanned in because it wasn't submitted electronically, or if it was done electronically, just do it that route. It would immediately be posted on the district's website, and people in the room would be told this thing that is being distributed now is being posted on our website now if you want to go look at it. So you still have to try to get it to people at the same time. And then the last category is sometimes you have people come to board meetings, and again, when they're live board meetings, they'll distribute. Here's a picture of the view of the school from my backyard. And I want the board to be aware of this as they think about what to do with the building. The general rule on that is you don't have to distribute that at the meeting because you weren't ready for it. But after the meeting, if somebody asks for it under the Public Records Act, you have to make it available. So it still becomes a public document at that point. So just be aware of that rule that generally speaking, when it goes to the board, it goes to the public at the same time. That's somewhere we get tripped up sometimes. Okay, so if there aren't questions, I'll go on. Now we're going to get into some meaty part of this on the next slide. We're going to talk about public participation at board meetings. So we can go to that next slide. So in talking about public participation, this is the make it or break it in a lot of ways for school boards as to the efficiency of their meetings. How you do with public participation, allowing it without giving up control of your board meeting. And we have the classic statement here. It comes from CSBA, but it's used by everybody. A school board meeting is a meeting of the board held in public, not a meeting of the public held in front of the board. This is your only chance to conduct business. You only generally get together with each other 2 times a month. My dad, who was the chairman of the board of a large corporation before his retirement, when he heard about that requirement, said, if we could only meet every other week with our decision makers for a few hours, our corporation would have gone out of business. It's a really, really hard thing to do, which means you need to keep your events efficient. You need to keep your meetings running smoothly. The public is there to watch you. The public is not there to dictate how the meeting goes. And one of the things to recognize with that is that every you remembers the out of turn, things out, speaking up when they're not recognized yet, that's a problem, because the more that happens, the more that your meeting can get sidetracked. And it's not that you don't want these folks to participate. There's rules to the participation. And I tell this story a lot, so if I've told you before, please excuse me, but I went to one school board where it was my first time at one of their meetings. I was dealing with them on a property issue. And I always do this. I looked up in advance, who are their board members and who are their staff members. And I showed up and I sat in the audience and I looked up and the meeting starts, and at the dais is the superintendent and a couple assistant superintendents and the 5 board members with the signs in front of them as to their name, that they were board members, and 2 other people who had no plaque in front of them and were sitting on folding chairs at a card table at the end of the dais. And I figured district consultants or somebody, but then when they got to voting on matters, these two people were raising their hands to vote, which was very curious to me. And throughout the whole meeting, I couldn't figure out what was going on. So I asked somebody after the meeting who these people were, and we're told one of them was a former school board member who was no longer on the board, and the other was somebody who ran for board unsuccessfully, did not win. And they insisted on sitting with the board and being allowed to vote on items and comment along with the board on items. And I was in disbelief, and I just said, why do you allow them to do that? They're just members of the public. They get the same rights as any other member of the public. And the board didn't fully grasp this notion that this was their meeting. They ceded part of their meeting to two people who asked to help take over the meeting. So after a little bit of work with that, I went back to future meetings, and those two people were sitting in the front row instead of with the board at the dais, and they were no longer trying to vote with the board. We got everything ironed out. It's a really good way for board meetings to go sideways. There is a public comment requirement that we talked about. You have the right to limit when public comment happens, how long it's going to be, what it's going to look like. What the time you can adopt reasonable regulations that talk about time limits. You have your 3-minute time limit. You have your discretion to narrow those time limits if there's a lot of speakers. All of that is allowable at a board meeting so that you can keep your meeting on track. And so that's a critical part of your ability to get through your business. You'll also see their recordings, photography. People are allowed to record the meeting, whether it's there virtually or in person. They're allowed to take pictures during the meeting as long as they're not being disruptive in doing so. And the last bullet you see there is disruptions. I hope you never get to this point, but I want to pause on it for a moment, because what the Brown Act says is that if there's a meeting that is being disrupted to the extent you determine that you can't continue, you can't get your business done, you can actually clear the room and continue with your meeting with only the media being allowed to remain in the room if there's any reporters there, unless they were the ones who caused the disruption. You can actually clear the room and keep going. You don't see this happen very often. You hope it doesn't happen very often. But we've had the question come up recently, how does that work on if you're having people Zoom bombing and you don't have that under control, if you're doing all of this virtually, if you have people speaking out of turn? The best answer is that you control it so that somebody cannot speak without being recognized. They can't just speak up in the middle of your meeting. If they have an issue or a question, that there's a vehicle for them to raise it at the right time. But that if you can't control it for any reason, theoretically, I would say you could turn off the audio and just have people watch and not be allowed to participate if they're being unduly disruptive. This would be an extreme case. You wouldn't see this happen very often, but it's another way that the legislature made clear that the public doesn't get to hijack your meeting. It is still a meeting of the board in front of the public, and that's a really important distinction to make. If you go to the next slide, continuing with the same thought, your board bylaw 9323, so this is the one right after 9322 we were talking about earlier, lays out the reasonable regulations you've adopted. The Brown Act says you can adopt reasonable regulations. This is where you did it. Comments are 3 minutes. You can allow a total time limit of only 20 minutes per item. What does that mean? It means that if you have a controversial item, there's a lot of people that want to speak, you can randomly select who's going to get their 3 minutes each. And at 20 minutes, you can close public comment on that item. Your board policy allows you to do that. That's based on a CSBA model. So this is not unusual. This isn't a weird thing. Most districts will overlook that and keep going and allow people to comment. But we did find when we first went to virtual meetings a year ago now, just a little bit less than a year ago, in various districts, there are a lot more comments than there used to be. So it's a lot easier to do it from your living room than from board meetings. And there were districts that were starting to have to impose this 20 minutes per item just to be able to get through the items that they had. Board president has the authority under your bylaws to adjust timeframes. So they could say instead of 20 minutes, it could be 30 minutes. They could take that 3 minutes and reduce it to 1 minute if they know that there's a lot of speakers on a particular topic, or even if the meeting is getting late. You can poll speakers. Now, this is a great thing to do in a live meeting. Your board bylaw, basically, if you wanted to limit time to 20 minutes, you could always say, well, we're only going to allow 20 minutes of speakers, but at the end of the 20 minutes, we're going to ask for a show of hands. How many people support this? How many people oppose it? And that is allowed to you. It's harder to do virtually. There are techniques of doing it. There's polling techniques that you can use online. It's a lot harder online though. And then this last point, you can't limit public comment based on content, but you can limit the discussion to the topic. So I want to pause for a moment and talk to you about what I mean by that. One of the things that comes up when there's public comment, you have a few options. If somebody comes up and starts saying something that is, you believe, defamatory to a district employee, both federal case law and the Brown Act say you have to let them keep going. You can't cut off somebody's speech because you disagree with the content of the speech. Now, you can always say, interrupt without counting the time against the person. You can have the board president or superintendent or others intervene and say, this is about a particular employee. We respect the privacy of our employees. We'd ask that you please bring this up. We have a complaint process that we can do outside the meeting, but you can't tell the person they can't continue. You can open the door to other avenues they may not be aware of making that comment, but if they want to keep going, they get to keep going. So what happens if somebody gets up and they start saying something that is totally offensive? It's offensive because of content. It's offensive because of profanities that are being used. The general rule, First Amendment, free speech rights, is you're limited in your ability to say, we're going to stop you because of what you're saying. But you may be able to stop them because of how they're saying it. And by that, what I mean is, if they are saying it in a way that is going to incite violence, if they're trying to call people up to attack the board, that goes beyond content. That goes to the how of what they're saying it. And even under the free speech rights of the First Amendment, you'd probably have a right to cut off their microphone, if you will. If they use a lot of profanities, I would argue, even if it's, well, I'd say particularly for a school district, because some may have kids watching your board meeting, particularly for a district that's not just a high school district, but a unified district. If somebody is using a lot of profanity, you can encourage them to model behavior, to please watch their language. And if it continues unabated, there is basis for you to say that they are now disrupting the meeting, and you can cut off the microphone. And by the way, there's a penal code section in California that makes it a misdemeanor to interrupt or disrupt a public meeting. And if somebody is really using foul language, inciting violence, doing things along those lines, that's a disruption. We're not cutting them off based on their beliefs or their free speech. We're cutting them off because of the violence, because of the profanity and the like. But there's another piece of this, which is, what if they're just going off topic? So there's a topic on the agenda and they're talking about it and they start to stray far from the topic. You are within your rights, again, to encourage them back to the topic. So if it's a specific agenda item, I'm going to use aliens as an example. And by this, I mean space aliens, because it's an absurd example, but it'll illustrate it. If you have a topic, for example, about your LCAP, and you're getting public comment on the LCAP, and this is all very healthy stuff, and somebody gets up and they start talking about the LCAP, but then they start talking about how aliens from space are influencing the LCAP, I would argue that they may have gone off topic because they're no longer talking about the LCAP, they're talking about the aliens from space. And it's a hard line to decide when to stop them, but you can always encourage them to come back to the topic. The topic at hand is the LCAP. Please limit your comments to the LCAP. If they're commenting during general public comment, when they can speak on anything within the jurisdiction of the district, that's another opportunity for somebody potentially to go off topic. And I'm going to use the space aliens example again. If somebody gets up and starts talking about space aliens are taking over the world, you can probably say that's not within the jurisdiction of the district and cut off their microphone. If they say that space aliens are taking over the school board, you probably still would be within your rights to say no. If they start talking about they saw an alien vandalizing the school on X date, and they have videotape of it, maybe they really saw somebody vandalizing the school, which is within the jurisdiction of the district, and maybe it's appropriate to let them finish those comments. And the other piece of this, and we saw your board president do this in a recent meeting, it's also okay before, after, and every now and then even during, to let people in the audience know this is general public comment. We have to allow comment on anything within our jurisdiction. This is not an expression of the district's views or beliefs. This is just something we are required to allow. And your board president did that after a recent public comment. I thought it was an effective time to do it. So all of this is by way of saying, when you put this together, yeah, the public has a right to comment, but I mean, look at this. You can limit their time. You can limit the overall time of an item. You can adjust that on the fly as you need to. You can limit people who are going well off topic or are saying things that may be insightful to violence, that start slipping into topics that are outside of the jurisdiction of the district. So you still have a lot of control of your board meeting. You just have to be aware of being careful about where to sound off on that. And one tip for the board members, this is one of the hardest things I think a board president has to do, is decide at that moment of, do we turn the mic off now or not? We had one district years ago that had this problem really blow up. And one of the attorneys from our firm was actually sitting there with their finger on a button to kill the mic. So the attorney could just make the call about when to do it. That's an extreme case. But your board president is listening closely. They may be thinking about the next agenda item. They have to think about, keeping the meeting moving. If you feel that somebody's going off topic, if you feel that somebody has basically just not complying with your regulations, you can always have a board member in the middle of a public comment say point of order. It's just a procedural rule, point of order, be recognized by the board president and just say, I believe that this has gone off topic, which is your way of calling to the board president's attention. We may want to cut off this comment at this point. Obviously, it's not something you want to do all the time. Free speech is a really important thing, but it's your board meeting. You've got to get to your business and you've got to keep things on track. You've got to protect the kids who are watching these things. So, you've got to be mindful of it. I remember one city council meeting I was at, and there was a city council member who came unglued and started physically going after some other city council members. I've seen a lot over the years I've been doing this. And the reason that's memorable for me is not because that happened, because believe it or not, I've seen it happen more than once. It was because it was a Cub Scout merit badge day, and the front 3 rows of the audience were Cub Scouts, were little kids watching the city council member start swearing and physically going at people. Well, that was a moment where the mayor in that instance stopped the meeting, cleared the room, got everybody calmed down, got everybody back on behavior, came back in, apologized to the kids, explained that sometimes in government things grow heated, and assured everybody that everything would stay on track. So you can help each other. You can help your board president, because sometimes you'll see this coming before the board president catches it, even for the best of board presidents, and make that point of order. And it's okay to stop somebody when they're speaking to discuss through procedurally, is this within the jurisdiction of the board? And it's a way that you help keep control of your meeting. And I was also going to mention on the same thought on the next slide, if we could, Logan, there's this case that came down in 2018, the Ribicoff case, that tested and reiterated a lot of the rules that we were talking about, because you had a member of the audience, Mr. Ribicoff, like to go to every city council meeting and comment on every agenda item. And what happened at a particular meeting was that he had his 3 minutes of comment, he sat down, a member of the public had something to say, and then he wanted to get up and rebut that. He wanted another 3 minutes to rebut what the member of the public said. And the city council said, no, you had your 3 minutes, you're done. And asked him to sit down, and he wouldn't, and continued to ask him to sit down, and he wouldn't. And the police ultimately removed him and charged him with the misdemeanor for disrupting a meeting, which I described before. And Mr. Ribicoff sued the city and said, you violated my free speech rights. And in addition to the fact I should have been allowed to comment again because somebody was responding to something I said, I don't think it's fair that staff always gets 10 minutes to present and I only get 3 minutes. Why don't I get the same time as staff? And all of this is pretty obvious what the court did, but the appellate court came down and spelled it out so it's clear to everybody that the board gets to control the time limits. If somebody's been given their 3 minutes and used it, they're done. They cannot speak again. And if they do, they can be removed from a meeting for disrupting the meeting. And the court had a very good discussion about there's a reason that staff gets more time to present than the public does, because it's a business meeting of the agency. This is their professional staff presenting. The board gets to decide, the district gets to decide who gets the time to do the presentation, which may mean that staff gets to give a 10-minute or 20-minute or whatever it is PowerPoint, and members of the public don't get to present a PowerPoint. They can always submit something in writing. They can have their 3 minutes of public comment, but that's really the limitation. And Rubakoff just did a really good job of sort of cementing that. And there was one other case on the next slide, and I will stop in just a little bit and take questions, but I want to finish this sort of concept. This 2019 case about putting time limits on agenda items to the time when the agenda item is considered. This was a case where the plaintiffs argued that because members of the public often have to get home and have kids and they can't stay around for long, they wanted to have all public comment happen at the beginning of the meeting on all of the items on the agenda, 3 minutes on each of those items. And the services district said no. We're going to allow the public comment to come up as it happens on that particular item because it's easier for us to run an orderly meeting that way. The plaintiff was dissatisfied, filed a lawsuit, and the appellate court again clarified it's the public agency that controls the meeting. So I emphasize all of this because I have seen board meetings, including yours, where members of the public will assert, why aren't we being given more time? Why is district staff being given more time? Why are you imposing these time limits? The answer is because the law permits it, and in fact, the law intends it. That is what the Brown Act talks about. That's what these cases decided talk about, is that it's your meeting and you get to keep control of your meeting. And then the last piece of this that I'll just share with you, and we're going to come back to it, and then I want to throw it open to questions and discussion, is that when you're having public comment, I mentioned earlier, if it's on a particular agenda item, so it's already been agendized to the public, if somebody speaks, the board can respond. You've agendized the item. We generally recommend you don't respond during their public comment or immediately after it, because this is not a dialogue between the public and you. This is the chance for the public to share their thoughts, and you take that into consideration as you deliberate and act. It's not a discussion back and forth. And that's a really important thing for members of the public to understand, that again, it's you doing your business. Now, if it's a meeting of the board where you are taking general public comment at a regular board meeting, so this is on the open public comment period at the beginning, on anything within your jurisdiction, the Brown Act only allows you to do very few things. You can respond briefly. What do we mean by respond briefly? We think of it as things like, thank you for your comments. That is a brief response. Saying, I disagree with you, and the reason I disagree is the following 3 reasons, is not a brief response. That's getting into a debate. So brief response. You can make an announcement. So if somebody from the audience says, I'm upset because the district never does X, and the superintendent or the board president knows that the district's already scheduled to do X, they can respond by saying, actually, that's been scheduled for February 27th and this time, and you'll find that on our agenda. So you can make a brief comment. You can ask a question. Usually we treat these as clarifying questions. So if you legitimately did not understand what somebody in the member of the public said, I didn't hear that word, I don't understand it, I'm not following you on this, without being combative, it's okay to ask. It's also okay to ask staff, do you have an understanding of this matter? But the reason you don't get into it in detail is it's not on your agenda. So if you start having a discussion about what the member of the public raised in general public comment, you're now having a board discussion of an item that was not agendized. So the public was not on notice you're going to talk about it. And that's a problem and a potential Brown Act violation. Another thing that board members can do under the Brown Act, if somebody raises something that's of concern to you, rather than commenting back to the person, you can turn to your staff and say, I'd like to see this on a future agenda, or I'd like to see staff respond to this after this meeting, or would staff please follow up with this individual? That's about all you can do. And if members of the public don't understand that, it's helpful to explain to them that you're limited by the rules of the Brown Act to how much you can engage with them during the meeting. So you'll have people stand up and make presentations to the board and ask questions. I want to know X, I want to know Y. And they will ask repeated questions of you. this is not the place to be answering the questions unless there's a readily easy answer that usually staff can give. Usually the answer is to look to staff and say, can you please get this information out? And it's awkward because somebody will stand up and say, I demand to know what the board's position is on this. And they will stare you down for a full minute asking this question. The best answer you can give is, we're not allowed to respond because this was not on tonight's agenda. That's about all you can do. So I've said a lot about sort of the public participation piece, and I'm going to suggest we pause here to see if there's questions, discussion. We'll be talking more about, what happens after the public comment period in your meeting. But are there any comments or questions about this part? This is a hard part.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What about an anonymous caller? So, when we're in the boardroom, in order for someone to speak, they have to be there. They have to, short of wearing a bag over their face, I guess, they have to, present themselves. So now with the virtual board meeting, there's that opportunity for people to call in and be anonymous. Is that within Brown Act? Do we have the right to ask them to tell us who they are, or is that part of that freedom of speech?
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That's a great question. And this comes up a lot even without the virtual meetings, even during live meetings. What the Brown Act says is that you can't require anybody as a condition of attending a board meeting to identify themselves. You can't make them sign a registry that says who they are. The Brown Act never addresses your specific question. It never says, yes, you can prohibit somebody from speaking if they don't say who they are. But under rules of statutory interpretation, the legislature said you can't compel somebody to identify themselves and register as a condition of attending the meeting. If the legislature had meant to say you also can't require them to identify themselves as a condition of speaking, they would have said that. And so under those rules of statutory interpretation, our understanding is that the district is legally authorized to compel somebody to identify themselves before they comment, not to attend the meeting. They can watch, they can attend the meeting live or virtually, but to participate, they have to identify themselves. And one of the policy reasons behind that is that oftentimes when people speak, there'll be a follow-up issue that comes up. They'll raise an issue of concern, and you want to follow up with that person, which you cannot do if they have not identified themselves. On top of which, your minutes reflect the comments at the public meeting, and it's a fairly ineffective set of minutes. If you have 12 different anonymous speakers, you're not even going to know from the minutes who spoke on which. It becomes a morass. So in our interpretation, the legislature's left it up to the school board to decide whether you want to allow anonymous speakers or not. One of your neighboring school districts, and I may have mentioned to this last time, Dublin Unified sort of thought about this issue. And what they ended up concluding was they wanted to allow anonymous comments even at live meetings. And so they expressly invite people not to identify themselves by name at meetings. I know other public agencies that will not allow anybody to speak unless they fill out a speaker card that identifies who they are. And in the virtual world we're in now, it's harder without the speaker cards. But the district could decide, we don't want to allow anonymous comments. Somebody's going to have to identify who they are instead of just being a phone number or anonymous. It's tricky because if their visual is not there, you don't really know if it's who they say they are. But similarly, if somebody stands up at a school board meeting and says that their name is Charles Manson, you don't know that their name isn't Charles Manson. You may suspect that it's not, but you don't know that it is. So this is a policy decision about what the board wants to allow. The board president has a lot of control over this during board meetings, but it may be something the district wants to consider, whether it wants to restrict it or not. The Dublin logic, the Dublin Unified logic was they wanted to encourage free speech and participation. There are people who are uncomfortable speaking because they're afraid that they're going to get hate mail or follow-up or goodness forbid threats or whatever else it is. And so they made a conscious decision, which their board president felt very strongly about, that people should be allowed to comment without identifying themselves. But I can walk you up and down the state to a lot of cities in particular that will not allow anybody to speak without identifying themselves. And it's completely up to you what you want to do with that under the law. It's a long way of saying it's up to you.
Thank you.
Other questions on public participation?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What happens after COVID is under control and we go back to our regular in-person meetings? Are we, now that people have gotten used to being able to call in on Zoom and the meetings are live streamed, are we going to be going back to our original setup where people have to come to the meeting, fill out a card and go through that process and actually show up in person? Or are they going to be able to call in also like they're doing now? I'm just wondering because of the public's expectations around now that they've gotten used to this format, and it's so much easier to sit at home behind a computer or on the phone to talk to us. It's changed the way the meetings are. It's created a lot more challenges in the meetings.
Yeah, that is the question of the day, Shelley, that we're really thinking a lot about. Legally, the district could go back to having live meetings without any calling in or ability to do this any other way than either passively watching on live stream at home or coming to the board meeting if you want to comment. It's going to remain up to the school board and the school district if you want to decide to still allow what we'll refer to as the hybrid board meeting approach, which is you can either speak in person or you can attend virtually and speak virtually and be recognized. My crystal ball suggests more often than not, we're going to go back to the personal live meeting because it's just, you don't have to worry about the technology breaking down. It's a much easier process to go through. The speaker cards are wonderfully helpful. Again, with the speaker card, you ask somebody to identify their name, what item they want to speak to, so you have clarity. You don't have confusion afterwards about, oh, this person wanted to weigh in on this issue. So I don't know the answer to that question yet. I think it'll be interesting to see what trend happens when things do really start reopening. I do think that's a question the district will have to think about. Obviously, you maximize public participation potentially by allowing people to keep attending virtually, but you're not required to do that. And you may maintain better orderly conduct of your meeting by not allowing people to attend virtually. So as with the last question, it's a long way of saying it's going to be really up to the board on what they want to do with this.
And if I can just add, I think we also have to take into consideration just how we operationalize things and the complexity of that operationalizing, because if we've got technological things happening with Zoom and call-ins, and we've got yellow cards happening and people going to the podium, we might actually reach a place where it's just too difficult to manage. But having said that, as Harold suggested, I think all districts are going to come out of this COVID time trying to determine when should we return to what we did before, because it makes more sense. And where might we have learned something new that we should incorporate? So I think that I would suggest from a staff perspective that we revisit some of these questions that are specifically within your authority when we get a little further along in this process and kind of get a sense of how things are going to be post pandemic, hopefully getting there sooner than later.
Yeah, I think those are very good points, John. And I will say that before COVID, we had districts that made very conscious decisions. For example, nobody could give a written comment for somebody else to read into the record for them. They wanted to see people there in person. And again, it can become abusive. There was a district that we worked with that allowed people to send written comments that would be read aloud if somebody else was there willing to read it. So what happened was that 3 people showed up at the board meeting with public comments from 80 other people, and they wanted to spend 3 minutes reading each of those. Well, after that, that district decided, nope, if you want to address the board, you've got to be here in person. Although they left an opening, if somebody had a specific need and reached out to the superintendent's office in advance and could identify, I'm in the hospital or some other compelling reason, then they would take that under advisement. But these are all policy decisions the board's going to have to make. And Logan, it actually, if you go to the next slide, kind of transitions perfectly Shelley's question about what's going on with public comment right now at virtual board meetings. Under the Brown Act, before everything was put in abeyance because of COVID, you had to have a physical board meeting location. You had to have one location where people could show up. You had to have a quorum of your board located within the district boundaries. Although board members could call in electronically or telephonically, they'd have to allow for public comment at their location as well. So if somebody came to your house, because that's where you were doing your meeting from, you had to let them in and let them make public comment there. So it's very tricky. The current rules that the governor laid out in his emergency orders is that you don't have to have any physical location for the board meeting at all. That's different from his original order. His original order back in last March said you still had to have a location that was live for people that still wanted to come, but that got removed. And the public has to be able to comment telephonically or otherwise electronically. And we have spent 11 months trying to figure out what the words telephonically or otherwise electronically actually means. It seems to mean that somebody could call in. It seems to mean that if you have Zoom or Google Meets or whatever it is you're using set up, that they can get on electronically. But some districts have also interpreted this, if somebody submits an email, that you'll read their email aloud. That a lot of districts did that in the beginning and have moved away from it. Sarah, your communications person, can tell you all about the lessons from her prior district, where they initially were letting people submit electronically with all of those being read aloud. It made the meetings very, very, very long. So where we are now is for the most part, you have to actually let the person's voice be heard. And if they want to submit something in writing, just like they always could have before, they will, but it won't necessarily be read aloud. So I did want to just point out, especially for your new board members, the world will change very soon. Everything will shift on this, and we'll have to figure out what we're going back to and what we're not. Any other questions on public participation?
I have one more.
Yeah.
So you talked about public comment on consent agenda items, and speaking before the consent agenda items or right after to see if there's anything that wants to be pulled, that needs to be, the public wants to pull or talk about. We had a situation come up where there were association president report, and one of our public called in and was upset because they didn't get to comment on that. And I think at one point you had brought up some of the boards are like having 3 different times during the meeting where they allow public comment. Without encouraging public comment on everything that's on the whole agenda, how do we make sure that we are supplying the public with the correct opportunity for them to comment on the agenda items, period, whether they're agendized or not? I know that we have a section for non-agenda items, but that kind of became a gray area.
Yeah, well, starting with consent, hopefully you're only having 1 or 2 items pulled. And so it's okay to have the discussion at that time, and you're not running into the problem that Ken described where somebody pulls all of the items. They pull all of the items again, you might be able to allow public comment just on that. As far as the individual items on the calendar, most districts, most public agencies in the state, local agencies, will allow public comment on each item as it occurs. That's the most typical model. There are more cities than school districts that will have just 1 public comment period up front on all agenda items. So you can either do it on all agenda items or all agenda and non-agenda items and give somebody a time limit. For the most part, we don't go to that until things start getting out of control. Because you also have other tools in your arsenal, like that policy that I read you, 9322 or 23, now I'm confusing the 2 of them, that allows you to, for example, decide we have 100 people that want to speak on this item. We're going to limit public comment to 20 minutes. We're going to make it 1 minute each instead of 3 minutes, and get through our meeting by streamlining it that way. If you start running into situations where it's just your meetings are becoming unmanageable because you have 50 people that want to speak on every topic, that's when I think you start thinking about, do we allow 1 general public comment period up front? That is a very unpopular way of approaching it. The public will not be terrifically happy with you. It also, from just a practical standpoint, to the extent that you're supposed to be listening to the public and taking what was said into consideration as you're deliberating and voting, if you've had the comment on it 3 hours before you get to the item, it's a lot harder to do it than if you have the item then and there. So my preferred approach is just operate within your rules to control the items. If you've closed public comment and somebody pops in and says, okay, I have a public comment, the answer might be public comment is closed. Because if you allow them, then somebody else is going to come in and somebody else is going to come in. If you allow somebody to speak a second time, like the case that we just talked about, the Ribicoff case, if they want to speak a second time, you tell them no to keep control of the meeting that way. And so to me, the preferred approach is to follow your other policies to allow public comment, excuse me, on each action item, and stay within that as you're doing it on the item. I have worked with some districts that split the baby, and if it's a discussion item, they have one public comment period up front on all discussion items, but then they allow public comment on each action item. That I don't know where that tradition comes from. It just seems to have evolved. Very few districts do that, but there are some. So part of it is for you to decide if your meetings are going till 2 in the morning and you're not getting to your business because of all the public comment, it may be time to revisit and think about how do we limit that in a way to comply with our legal obligations, our ethical obligations, and still get through all of our business. My thought, folks, it's 1:30 right now. And I think last time we gave everybody a little break at about the midway point, which is where we are now. So if it pleases the board president and the superintendent, I'm going to suggest it's 1:30, that maybe we take a break till about, if we can say about 1:38 or so, and regroup if that sounds good to everyone.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I wasn't sure, are there any other questions for Harold at this point on this topic right now? Before, because I don't want to cut off if someone has another question or a comment or anything, because we'll be moving on, I think, when we come back. No? Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, yeah. So that sounds good. Let's come back around, it's 1:32 now, so maybe like about 1:37, 1:38, around there. A 5-minute break. Okay, great, thanks. Hi, Harold. So, you know, I think we're probably most of us are back, and maybe some just don't have their video on. But I actually had a question, just to start this part. Thank you for all the points before, because that's very, very helpful on the really practical way that, right, we can conduct our meeting. And I was just wondering, because even before COVID, right, I would think that school boards, that there are a lot of controversial topics that would come up to school boards, different school boards, on certain topics and stuff. And when you say how many, and I would think that they would have times where they want to balance, right? They have a hard time balancing, allowing the public to speak all the, on what they want, and to, again, limit so that we have time, so it doesn't go into into middle of the night, and so that we're all still, mentally fresh to discuss something, right? A agenda topic. So I'm very intrigued by, this poll idea. And I know I know that even for our school board, when we had the in-person meeting, I remember other board presidents had said, okay, come up and talk about this topic. But if others, right, with all the yellow cards, if you agree, you might not want to take your 3 minutes. So I'm just wondering how many, in your practice, do you see a lot of different districts that use this kind of limiting time on a total time on a topic, and maybe doing the poll?
I wouldn't say a lot. I've certainly seen it used, and sometimes it's just contextual. Sometimes they've never done it before, but they get to one item that's so big that it's the only way to get through the item. So I usually see it as something not as a standard practice, but as a let's keep it in our back pocket, and when we need to, we'll pull it out. I do think it's more common for cities and other, municipal local agencies under the Brown Act to have a more limited approach like that. But I've certainly seen school districts do it. I kind of like the have the rule, know the rule, keep it in your back pocket for when it's necessary, because particularly around school closure and school reopening issues over the last year, we've had meetings in multiple school districts around the state that, were 8, 10, 12-hour board meetings. And there's always people who have something interesting to say, but you also reach a point where you're hearing a lot of the same thing repeated over and over again. So that show of hands, that polling, and the other thing you can always do is invite people. It's okay to write your school board, send an email to the superintendent, the board president, send, write to your elected officials and share your thoughts. You don't have to stand up at the board meeting and say it unless you really feel important about doing that. I do find that when we've encouraged members of the audience, maybe a half hour into a discussion of something and just say, we're starting to hear the same types of things over again. And so, we're going to ask for a fill in the blank. We're going to ask that if a speaker's saying something you agree with, wave your hands, the sign language applause, right? If you hear somebody who says something you've already said, it's okay to either pass on speaking or just stand up and say, I agree with what Robbie said, or what Joseph said, and sit back down. And if you give direction like that, we find a lot of times the audience will go along with it without having to be a little bit more draconian and say, okay, it's 20 minutes, we're cutting you off. But if it's a repeat problem and you're just not getting through your business, you may need to seriously look at it. It's in your board bylaw for a reason, that you can poll, that you can have the 20-minute limits. And I think a lot of it is how respectfully are you doing it? Are you modeling behavior by being very respectful, letting the audience know we always prefer to get more comments, but we have 6 more items to get to tonight and it's 10:30 at night and these are important business items, so we're going to follow the 20-minute rule. You also want to be very careful, by the way, that you're not, I'm trying to find a nice way to say you're not weaponizing it, but I'll just say it that way. I have seen public agencies make the mistake before of not imposing time limits up until the opposition gets up, and then all of a sudden they decide to impose time limits. Well, that's a free speech issue. You've got to do it, randomly. I was at one board meeting where they invited the audience on their speaker cards, this was again meeting live, to write the word, in addition to writing everything down, to write the words pro or con or undecided at the top of their yellow card. And they knew they were going to have to limit time, so they made stacks. One was a random stack of pro, one was a random stack of con, one was a random stack of undecided. And they decided that they would let, I think, 3 or 4 people from each of those randomly speak, so they were getting a mix. I thought that was great. I thought that was a good way of making sure were getting the perspective of all the different sides.
Rachel?
I just think it would be really important if we were to implement this poll idea that it's in the context of a time limit, and that it's in the context of letting the people in the room or on the Zoom or whatever to have their say, because we're going to be limiting it. I'd be really careful about this is where you're voting, you're weighing in, because we've had items in the past where the room is stacked but doesn't represent the public at large because of how something got publicized, and people were outraged with us that we didn't vote the way the majority of the room did, or how the room felt. And that, it's that whole thing about direct democracy versus representative, and it gets really sticky. So I would think only polls if it's in the context of a time limit, and just making sure that those who showed up's voices were heard, even though they didn't get to speak.
The one thing I would add on that is, if you look at the way it happens with legislative committees, where the main opponents and proponents have a certain amount of time up front to make their case, and everyone else is invited to come up only to state their name, their organization, and that they support or oppose something. But the difference is that that's done and known well in advance, that when you go and you're waiting for your chance, that that's all you're going to be allowed to say, as opposed to our folks, where a number of our folks actually come with their written statements. They've timed it, they know how much they can say, around 3 minutes. And I think that's where it creates some issue if folks come thinking that they're going to be able to have all this time to say, and then we don't give them that time. So that again is one of those balancing acts in terms of knowing what the practice is going to be before the item hits.
Yeah.
Hey, Ken, I'm sorry, I was just going to say really quickly, Laura, that's a really good point. And most districts I know that have started implementing the 20-minute limit, which they may already have a policy on, but they haven't done before. They don't just do it one night. They let people know in advance, starting next meeting, we're going to be doing this, or starting in 2 meetings. So I think that's a very good point to address expectations. So I'm sorry, Laura, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And that was kind of my point. And maybe with the idea of, if we know that this is going to be a topic, an agenda item that's going to have a lot of comments, and that we have 5 action items on our agenda, and as it looks, we're going to go to 11. And if there are 30 people that are commenting on that one agenda item, we're looking at going to 1 o'clock in the morning. Of then that Friday before, letting the community know we will be limiting public comments on our agenda items to, let's say 20 commenters or whatever that number is, so that then people can prepare, and then maybe actually having, I don't know, this is maybe too crazy, but having a sign up so that it is, I don't know if this is possible in around the Brown Act, but so that people have some control over, yes, I get to speak, I'm going to prepare, or this time I'm not going to have an opportunity to speak in the board meeting, so I will send an email instead, giving them that knowledge and that opportunity in that way. I don't know if that's possible, but.
And Harold, if I could just jump in before you answer, I think what would be really helpful is for the board to decide, based upon the learning and the discussion, what we can add to the bylaws that will allow for public voice, democracy, appropriate business of the board to happen. And that obviously we would do that at a scheduled public meeting, and Harold could certainly be present to assist us through that discussion. But I think what's helpful about this discussion here in this workshop is it's allowing all of us to think about whatever strategies the board decides, as long as they are explicitly stated, then everybody understands what the parameters are, and we don't get into the situation where there are too many gray areas that leave room for interpretation that if something is quite contentious, can cause all kinds of hard feelings and difficulty. So what I'm appreciating about this workshop discussion is it's certainly teaching me to go back to our bylaws and to start thinking about what I might bring forward to you in a public space. But I'm also grateful that you're having this conversation in a public space in a discussion fashion, because it's allowing us as staff to take down some of the notes of what you're thinking about. But Harold, because there was a specific question from Laura, I didn't want to interrupt that. So back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, John. And, Laura's, the bottom line is on the question of, could you have something set up where people submit their cards and are told in advance, yes, you're going to be the one allowed to speak. I think that that's within the law. There's nothing in the Brown Act that says you have to wait till the night of the board meeting to take the toll of who it is that's going to be speaking and who's not. And so certainly it's something the board can talk about. Administratively, it might become a bit of a burden. And the other thing that's challenging about it is there's a lot of times where people with best of intentions intend to go to a board meeting and then they can't make it. So now you've selected them and they're not there, and how do you substitute? But going back to John's point, I think you can talk through this, and this is a great item to really drill down in on. You've already got your board policy 9322 that talks about limiting time and the 20 minutes, revisiting that and really thinking about, even if you're not going to change any of the words in the bylaw, to just think through how you're going to apply it, how it's going to work in practice. I think it's a great discussion to keep going.
Hey, Harold, I wonder if I can just digress for just one moment and ask John, given his experience in Toronto with a much larger school district and recognizing the open meeting laws probably were quite different, I just wonder if how they might have handled, these kind of topics in terms of a public comment.
So interesting question.
Yeah, particularly on these larger type of issues, more confrontational type.
So interesting that the laws around open and closed meetings are almost identical. So that is not in any way different. The Brown Act would add some nuances that I wouldn't have dealt with, but that's why I was quite intrigued by Harold's last comment, because it wasn't operationally challenging to actually be organized for a meeting in public comment, because the rules that I lived under in Toronto is you did need to make a decision that you were putting your voice forward. You did need to make that decision by noon the day before. And then we actually knew how much time we needed for public comment. So public comment wasn't necessarily limited in my previous jurisdiction, but sometimes the board would make a decision to schedule a continuation meeting because they knew that the public comment part would take 3 hours. And so why stay till 1 a.m? We might just actually schedule another meeting to do the business of the board after. But what was important, and I didn't know if this was connecting to the Brown Act or not, is you couldn't just comment based upon what you heard that evening. You actually had to state that you were coming. And it was something that we didn't mind if you didn't come, because if you called Mrs. Smith's name and she's not there, then you just go on to the next name. So it was organized, it was timed, and we knew before we went into the board meeting exactly how many hours would be required for public comment. And as I said, we sometimes picked another meeting night because the business of the board needed time after that public comment was finished. But Harold, I think that where I just went in answering Ken's question might now be skating into where the Brown Act might have something to say about what I just said. And I would want you to comment in this public space if that's the case.
I would also be really concerned that it doesn't give someone who hears something in the staff presentation, which, I mean, really, we want them reacting to this, the recommendation that's coming before us, not just the general issue. And so it would prevent them from commenting to that or what a previous commenter said. I mean, we've had meetings where we don't expect anything, but something comes up in the discussion that is gravely concerning to somebody, and I wouldn't want to prohibit that or require a delay of action because we had to handle it at a future meeting and then not be able to do the business at hand that night.
And I think
Yeah,
if I could just add this comment before Harold speaks, I think that what I've learned is determining what the law demands and then what values you as a board have regarding how you want the public to perceive their role in terms of their voice. It's your meeting, but their voice, and then ensure that whatever strategies are put into place actually meets that. All that I can say from being with you for the last couple of months is trying to manage how we're doing this in a virtual space is probably not the best litmus test, because I've been told that how you managed it before I got here in the physical space was good. Like, I mean, you had some nights where you needed to spend quite a bit of time, but that the process was pretty good. So probably it's also important for us to think about, you know, where you were before and where we hope to be soon, as opposed to how we might create too many rules for where we are now. The only thing I will suggest from a staff perspective, and it came up earlier, is, again, if it's what you value, we'll figure it out. But operationally, the thought of trying to do in the room and on Zoom in a meeting at the same time is probably the only thing I've heard that makes me get quite nervous, just because it's operationally really challenging. But short of that, and if you wanted that, by the way, we could figure it out. It's just that's the only initial thought that I had. But Harold, back to you regarding what you're hearing.
I think this is a very good discussion. I do think it's a discussion I'd encourage you to have more and, in fact, take public comment on, because there's nothing the public is more interested in than their ability to comment. The bottom line that I want to bring you back to on it with all of this is that what the Brown Act says is you have to allow public comment before you take action on an item. It doesn't say how you have to do it. It doesn't say you have speaker cards or you don't. It doesn't say people have to submit their names in advance. So you have a tremendous amount of room to work through really procedurally how you want to do it. And I was actually, if we can go to the next slide, Logan, this brings up the one of the slides that was one of the ones I really wanted to focus on today, which is substance versus process. And this is one that's really interesting to me, maybe because I'm a lawyer. If you read all the data and all of the information that's out there about dysfunctional school boards, the answer is that they spend more time on process at their board meetings than they do on substance. Process wins out over substance. There's data from the National School Boards Association that you should be talking during a school board meeting, you should be talking about issues affecting students 80% of the time if you want to be a functional school board. I work with some districts where we spend 50% of the time debating process during the meeting. That is not spending 80% of your time on issues affecting kids. And so what we're hitting on here is exactly the point I was going to make. The whole idea of the process is to have a way to get to the substance. It's not supposed to be an impediment. And the best thing you can do is get the process figured out before your meetings, in your policies, get this worked out so you can focus on your meetings on the substance. So, when we're talking about everything we've just spoken about regarding public comment, have this figured out in advance of when the big controversy happens, instead of having to do it when unexpectedly 200 speakers show up on a particular item one night, and for the first time ever, you're confronted with it. That is the lawyer in me telling you basically work through these process things in advance. And one of the points that I wanted to make on this slide, which in a lot of ways to me is one of the most important slides, even though it only has 2 real words on it, is what process do you have and what process do you want? One of the things that a lot of districts do is they make a very conscious decision. We're going to follow Robert's Rules of Order during board meetings. We're going to have a parliamentary approach. Now, Robert's Rules of Order, if you've ever read the book is at least an inch thick, and there's a lot of rules, and I don't know them all, and I've never met anybody who knows them all. But there's other rules. There's a set of rules called Rosenberg's Rules. Rosenberg was a judge who's also a former city council member who was frustrated with how hard it was to find things in Robert's Rules of Order on the fly. So he condensed it to Rosenberg's rules, which mostly follow Robert's rules, but streamline a bunch of things, and came out with a document that's maybe a dozen pages long instead of 100 pages long. And what these rules, whether it's Robert's rules or Rosenberg's rules, or some of the districts I work with, a vast minority, but a few have adopted their own rules of process instead of either of those two. They lay things out like when a motion is made, what happens next? If you take a vote on something and there's a change of heart, how can that come back to the board? A motion for reconsideration. To my knowledge, San Ramon Valley doesn't have anything formally adopted on any of that process. And there's upsides and downsides to it. Just like when we talk about what are you going to do around the public comment piece, if you have nothing specific in place, you have the maximum flexibility. The board president gets to make the call during the board meeting. If you have the process in place, you all have one set of rules that you have to govern by and that you can help support each other with and use as a way to get to the substance. There's pros and cons either way. But one of the things I always like to do at governance workshops is challenge those districts that have formally adopted Robert's rules by asking them, are you following them? Do you really want to be a Robert's rules district? And by challenging those that have not formally adopted any set of rules to ask them, do you want to adopt a set of rules? Is it time for you, even if it's just on the basics of, a lot of these rules, for example, is if a motion is made and then there's a further motion, procedural motion made on that, what order do you vote on those on? Well, Robert's rules say you vote on the last motion made first. If you don't have anything in effect, you're going to be thinking during your board meeting, how do we want to do that? And so I wanted to float that out there for you. That's something for future board consideration. And there's another piece of this too, which is, to my knowledge, the district doesn't have an adopted board governance handbook. More and more school districts in California are going to a board governance handbook. I happen to have just done a presentation for Albany Unified School District, a workshop recently. So I happen to have their governance handbook in front of me. I use them as an example because what a board governance handbook does is it adopts basic operating rules of engagement, if you will. And it helps you address things from both a policy standpoint and the standpoint of what do we do when X goes wrong? What process are we going to follow? In Albany's case, in most districts' cases, they started this by having CSBA come in and do a workshop with them to adopt an initial board handbook. And that's great. It's a good way to go. But a lot of districts then put the handbook on the shelf and never look at it again. Most of those handbooks say in them, we will revisit the handbook once a year. We will come back and as a board, look at the handbook, see if it says what we want it to say. And I use Albany as an example because they're better at this than any district I work with. They religiously, once a year, reopen their handbook. And as they go through it, they think about things. One of the things they did this year was they asked each board member to identify 3 to 4 of the protocols that are laid out in their handbook. There's 25, I think, in all that are laid out there. Pick 3 or 4 to see if they could come up with the top 3 or 4 that there was a consensus on to discuss. And that's what we did. And 2 or 3 of them won't change, and 1 or 2 of them probably will change as a result of the discussion. And there'll now be a process to do that. And just to give you an idea, I'm looking at Albany's table of contents. And just to give you a sense of, and they're not the only example in the world, they're just fresh on my mind. In their governance handbook, first they have their mission and vision statement, then they have their values and beliefs, then they have their strategic plan, objectives, and commitments. They have a diagram from CSBA, a 1-page diagram that kind of lays this out. They then have their agreements to facilitate governance leadership, which includes their meeting norms and their governance norms, which one of the things we did with them 2 years ago was nobody could say what the norms were. There were too many, so we reduced them to 4. And they actually have them on every agenda that they put out to the public, and they read them aloud at the start of every meeting, which I think is kind of a nifty little practice to do. Norms are things like, we will maintain a focus on what is best for our students, we'll ensure a safe environment for all views to be expressed, those kinds of concepts. And then they have these protocols, these 25 protocols. And just to give you an idea on some of them, they have a protocol on orienting a new board member. Most districts don't have that, which is kind of a nice thing to see. They have protocols on bringing up new ideas or agenda items, on asking questions of staff before board meetings, how abstentions can be used when you abstain from a vote, what the role of abstentions are. Board electronic communications, that's a part we'll be updating with them because of changes in the law recently on that. Board members' roles in public, parliamentary procedures, which procedure is it that they've decided to use, the role of the student board member. It goes on and on and on where they've listed these things. So if X happens, they all turn to the same page in the same handbook and they have an answer. They have things that are very interesting. The most interesting one to me is the following. They have a very active community. They have a very active board. And sometimes the board discussions got very animated. And sometimes they got so animated that people could not listen to one another well. There's more talking and sometimes shouting going on than listening. That is not your board. And nor do I say it's their board, but they've had some past issues with that. So we adopted a ripcord protocol. That's what I call it. It's not what they call it. Where if things ever get too heated in the opinion of any member of the board, that board member can make a motion on the spot to basically table the item that's being discussed with a determination then to be made whether it's going to be to another meeting or to later in the meeting, essentially to cool everybody down. That was a unique thing that they needed, and it's good for them to have. All of this is by way of saying your board has not, at least in recent years, to my knowledge, sat down and thought through these things. These very issues we were just talking about, public comment, boy, a board governance handbook would be a place you could address that. You could lay out the philosophy of it in more detail. So I wanted to just put out on the table for you all, when we talk about board policies, they're your basic rules, but these are really the day-to-day operating rules. How much do you want to formalize them? Is a governance handbook something the district would ever want to consider? Do you want to have a formally adopted version of Robert's Rules of Order or Rosenberg's rules or whatever other rule it's going to be? Or do you want to kind of keep things on that? I told you in the realm of districts I deal with, you're neither the most formal nor the least formal. So some of this would be making things a little bit more formal, moving in that direction. So I'm planting that seed for you today. And I'm wondering if there's comments or thoughts or questions about that.
Carol, I'll just make one quick comment. I think it's a really good idea for us to be looking into it. One of the things I think, and not as an excuse, but since we haven't had a tremendous amount of turnover on our board, just the informal organization of the board has really covered a lot of that ground, in terms of working relationship. But I think as you turn over even one board seat and you have a new relationship among the board members, it'd be really good to have something like this in place, because that's when I think the changes would occur. So, even if it weren't every year that you have a new board member, it might be worthwhile to have not only have something in place, but then to do that review to see how it might change, just given the different dynamics and personalities of the board itself.
Yeah, and I would say as a new board member that having this handbook would be extremely helpful. Partly because there's a big learning curve, and I think in the dynamic that Shelley and I stepped into, an even quicker learning curve, that it was a little more stressful than perhaps it could have been, and then it also kind of creates a place for us, because I'm finding as a new trustee with the Brown Act that there's a real strong sense of siloing. Like you're just, you don't even know who you can ask or what you can ask because you just don't know what the rules are. And so to have on paper, to have a handbook that kind of explains some of the things from the get-go so that it doesn't become a longer learning curve than it needs to be, I guess. So I would urge us to do that just for the future.
So I want to second what Laura said. As a new board member, especially stepping into this situation that we're in now, it would have been extremely helpful for me to have that, rather than, I think her and I were trying to gather. We brainstormed about what information we wanted or we thought we needed, but then there's the things that you don't know because you haven't done this before. So I think it would be very helpful. And the other part of this which is sort of a bigger picture thing, is that I feel like as a board, we need to find a way to educate our parent community. And if we had something like this that we could refer to, it would be very helpful, because I think, especially under the scrutiny that we're under now and how much public comment there is and how much emotion, there's not, if we had something like this where we could educate the parent community about what the rules and procedures are, it would be very helpful for everyone. Because I think people that haven't necessarily been involved deeply in the school district before this have little bits of information, and those little bits of information looking from the outside get turned into narratives that don't really have a lot to do with how things really are. And if it could be made more clear to the community how we function, what our function is, what the rules are that we're abiding by, and how it affects them, it would help to get rid of a lot of the confusion that's out there and a lot of the misinformation.
Yeah, good points. And if this is something that's of interest to the district, I can certainly follow up with staff on it. Again, a lot of districts, the first time they adopt a governance handbook, they'll have CSBA come in. They've got a program that they'll come in and do that. And it may be something worthwhile for you to go through. And again, as Ken points out, whether you update it every year or as new members come on, to pick up what Shelley said, if you go to the websites of Dublin Unified School District, Albany Unified, West Contra Costa Unified, there is a board governance handbook there for all to see and all to read. They're up right on the website. They're very prominent. I mentioned those districts just because they're all ones I know have one. I would hazard to guess that at least a third of the school districts in the state at this point have a governance handbook, maybe as many as half. And I think the number is growing. So it may be something to take a look at. And I love what Albany did, which is, they don't try to rewrite the whole thing every time. They just revisit which sections are of most interest. What did we learn this year that makes it more interesting to look at X section? So this was my part where I proselytized a little bit about planting the seed for you. It's not anything you have to or should decide today, but certainly something that the district can get more information on. And the districts that have been through this process, I think it's a great moment too of the board coming together to consensus on some things you may not even have thought about yet. So it offers a lot of opportunity.
And if I could just add quickly that as the newer superintendent, I really respect what Ken had to say about how kind of history and consistency allowed for certain things to happen effectively and easily. But truthfully, coming in newer as well, I've sometimes wondered about wanting to see some of those things, in one place that a handbook could provide, so we can carry that conversation forward. The other thought is, it's a discussion that Cindy Fisher and I have had, because, as you know, she has a major role to play, and I rely on her as well. And I'll be sharing with you down the road some ideas on how I might rethink some things so that she can continue to provide this kind of support. And I know that, we're all thinking of Cindy today, but that she had some real interest in doing some exploration in other districts, bringing some ideas forward to you to consider. So if it is, again, we can talk about this in a formal meeting structure. Just know that we've been giving some staff thought to how this idea that Harold is speaking about, and some of you have, all of you have actually commented on, could help just to make things even better going forward. So I just wanted to offer those comments.
Add one more onto that. I think I really appreciate Laura and Shelley saying, what they did in terms of that this would be helpful. I mean, I think it's just common sense that it would be helpful. There's so much to learn when you're coming on. I also think, because you never know how stable future boards will be, that it might be wise to think through that you would have this document and you would revisit it in the odd year between elections, so that new people would get adjusted to the current state before they start noticing where it can be better. I hope I'm being clear. I'm not saying that their input wouldn't be valuable, but sometimes you have to kind of learn the norms before you start rewriting the norms. And so I just think that might be something to think about. And since the elections are 4 years, but 2 years in between, doing the odd year in between might be the time for revisiting.
Yeah, thank you. These are good thoughts. And I'm going to do just a quick time check while we're here. We've got about 45 minutes left together. I was shooting to be done with this section, which we're just about done with in about 2 minutes. So what I'm going to actually suggest is I finish this section in about 2 minutes. I want to spend just a little bit of time with you on Public Records Act and then finish with the ethical issues. The ethical issues I'm not going to spend a lot of time with you on. It's mostly to call your attention to the rules rather than teach them to you today. But if it's okay with folks, I'd like to just finish up this one section and see if we can keep going. That said, if there's more dialogue you want to have, absolutely, let's have at it. So I just wanted to check in on that.
Yeah, I think that sounds good, Harold. Go ahead.
Okay. Good, thank you. Well, then let's go to the next slide. And really, I'm just going to finish this up briefly. What I did here is I just sort of diagrammed how a typical board meeting works. This isn't specifically spelled out in your policies. I will just tell you, I cheated a little bit because I lifted most of this from board governance handbooks. So now that we talked about board governance handbooks, that's where a lot of this comes from. So typically, the board president introduces the item. You basically say you got to that item on the agenda. It's always good to clarify how the public's going to comment and what the sequence of events will be. And we'll talk about what that sequence is. And the agenda itself describes the item and talks about when public comment's going to happen on it. So typically after that introduction, it's turned over to staff. Staff will make a presentation, often that includes a staff recommendation, depending on the item. And typically what then follows is not board deliberation nor public comment, but rather the board asking any clarifying questions about the presentation. I didn't understand this slide. I'd like to have more information. A lot of boards go sideways where they start getting into deliberation at this point. This isn't the point for deliberation. This is the point to make sure you understood the staff's presentation and recommendation. And then if we can go to the next slide. So after that process, you then typically have public comment. Now, again, we discussed earlier, you could move public comment earlier, but most commonly, especially on an action item, this is where public is invited to speak. And again, there's an end to that. And I think that's important. You know, when you close public comment, it is closed. You're not going to reopen it because somebody came in the room late, and you're not going to reopen it because somebody forgot to submit the card. There's a time period. You often, when meetings are live, you will actually say, now is the time to submit a comment card, and we're not going to take any more comment cards after X time. And so you can think about the right way to do that for your particular district. After that, the board has a chance to ask for any further clarifying questions. So this is your chance to ask staff, well, we heard from the public X, is that accurate? Do we have to be concerned about that? And after all of that, you go into your deliberation. You have the debate with each other, you share your opinions, you advocate for your position, and then you take your vote. So there's a distinct sequence. And if you can always follow the same sequence, your public learns that that's the sequence too. It becomes the rhythm for these meetings that everybody's familiar with. If we go to the next slide, so then you've had the board vote, and that's finally happened. And as part of that, and this is again lifted from a governance handbook, there's more than one right answer. Just because you voted one way doesn't mean that it's the only right answer. And everybody gets to have their say. When the board finally makes its final decision, up until then, you have an I message. You have the message if a member of the public asks, what is your thought on this? What's your opinion? You can always respond with, well, my feeling is this. You know, my belief is this. My concern is this. After the board votes, it becomes the we message. You know, we as a board decided to do X. I'm off of the I message. And then usually, and I think your board policies actually address this, if you're approached by the media about the decision, et cetera, there's usually a process. It's usually your board president or their delegee who is going to be addressing that information with the public. So that's the I to we trip that you go through. And then the last slide on the next page for this section is still in board law, bylaw 9323. So again, if you haven't gotten the hint, 9322 and 9323 is where all of this is laid out. We just really went through it in detail. You are one of many districts that adopted a rule about end time, that you're going to finish by 10. There's a tremendous amount of data that people do their best thinking after 10 p.m. That is the witching hour. That is the magic time. Is the data supports 10 o'clock, unless the board decides to extend the meeting. Interestingly, your policy says you will extend no more than once. That always makes me a little nervous, because what if you extend it by only a half hour and it suddenly turned out there was a really rich issue you wanted to discuss? And so there's reasons to do that, so you don't just keep this going forever. Not my favorite rule in the world, because I've had districts that couldn't get to important business because of that rule. Now, if you had adopted Robert's Rules of Order, see, this is where I start plugging the different rules, or Rosenberg's rules, you could at that moment vote to suspend your own rule. You could vote to suspend the rule that could only be extended one time, and by a supermajority of the board, suspend that rule and go ahead and extend it more. To me, I prefer a policy that says that you'll end by 10 unless it's extended, but not have the rule about only one extension, because it's limiting. But that's something that, again, as you think about your policies, you can look at. And in the very last slide, the next page.
Harold,
Yeah.
just our practice on this, as opposed to what the bylaw says, is our extension past 10 o'clock is not by a majority, it's unanimous of the board. And in fact, we have extended multiple times, not just once. So it looks like another section we may want to consider rewriting if we want to go with past practice as opposed to what's written on the bylaw currently.
Right. Well, I think when you're revisiting your policies along the way, these two that I've been talking about, 9322 and 9323, are a great place to start.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. And this slide, actually, I touched on earlier, so I'm not going to belabor it here, the different steps you can have in response to public comments. So we're only 5 minutes behind schedule. It's amazing, because I'd wanted to get here at about a quarter after. But unless there are questions on this section, I want to talk to you at least a little bit about the basics of the Public Records Act.
I have a question, or kind of maybe like a role play kind of situation.
Mhm.
So there's been a couple of times in the board meetings that I've been a board member of where a person has made a comment that has been marginalizing. It's just whether it's been a racial slur or a transphobic remark or whatever. And I'm curious, and I guess this is where that role playing kind of comes into effect. So I'm curious of what we can do to use that as an opportunity for education. You know, obviously, you know, people have a right to speak and to you know, to say what they want to say. But because we are a board of education, and because sometimes the remarks, you know, are extremely marginalizing, I think that I would like to be able to know how to use that as an opportunity, as opposed to, you know, just let it kind of go by the wayside and not address it. So I'm curious how that would look, if we can do that, and how it would look.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. You know, if this is a comment that's made by the public on general public comment, so it's not on the agenda, you're back to being very limited on what you can do with it. You could briefly make a comment, as the board president can do. You know, again, this is general public comment, they're free speech rights. This does not necessarily reflect the views of our district. You could, and it's perfect because the screen is up right now, you can ask a question or refer to staff. You know, we've heard tonight there's a concern about this. My concern is inclusion of all students. And so I think this is an important issue to bring back what our roles will be with it. You're not commenting on the substance, you're just talking about how to bring it back or have the staff address it. If it's a comment on an item that is on the agenda, you have a little bit more freedom. And again, you don't want to just engage in a dialogue with the public, but if somebody says something that is offensive, off-putting, I mean, in the worst cases, racist, sexist, whatever the situation may be, I don't think it's at all inappropriate for board members to respond. I want to make really clear, this doesn't reflect our views, and this doesn't reflect my view. And we have the following policies and norms in our district, and we welcome everybody equally. And you know, one of the things that I'm going to use Albany again as an example because of just recency. They have these norms that are stated on their agenda. They'll refer people back to the norms during the meeting. And, you know, one of their norms is about providing a safe space for everybody. Well, that would be a good opportunity to remind people, as it says right on our agenda, we are a safe place for everyone. That includes the people who are making the comments that offended you. It's got to be a safe place for them to be able to state their mind within reason. So the answer to your question will depend radically on whether or not it was an agendized item or not. If it is an agendized item, I think you can go into greater detail about your concern about what was said. But I do like the tool of referring things to staff. You know, we heard this tonight. I know this is going to be alarming to a lot of people. It does not reflect the views of the district. I'd like staff to comment or bring back to us, you know, what are our policies around this, to kind of let everybody know we are going to use this as a learning moment. We are going to come back to this and we're going to discuss it. And I've even had boards agendize an item that is specifically a discussion of fill in the blank, discussion of making people feel safe during public comment, or a discussion item regarding, well, one district did on use of pronouns. What is our approach going to be the use of pronouns in our district? So you can have that opportunity for learning, that opportunity to come back to the board. You just have to be a little careful about how deep you're going into it that night if it's not on the agenda.
And
There
Harold,
was discussion after the last board meeting about having a statement that's beefed up more than the one that we have, that would be read at the beginning of public comment and then at the end of public comment. Because what I'm a little bit afraid of is it seems appropriate for the president to be able to respond that way, and then, you know, they're responding for all of us. However, in the current situation, I feel like our board president is the target of some of these comments, and it's very hard for anyone to react and not react defensively, you know, when she's the person in that position. But I also don't want it to then get to be that it's kind of popcorn with whichever one of us pulls it together to respond quickly enough, and then it starts getting judged, well, you spoke up but you didn't, and then, you know, the Me Too's and all that. So I'm almost wondering if we want some kind of a agreed upon thing that we're going to do, or whether it's the vice president or the clerk or however, to share that responsibility so that we don't end up starting to look like we're competing over that sort of thing. That makes sense?
yes, and if I can add, Harold, we probably could use some assistance. We've heard from some of our public just in terms of emails and such, which isn't an official meeting. So this needs to come to a meeting where that introduction is created that aligns with the values of the board and the district, and that we do have it ready in a way that truly communicates what the board wants it to communicate. And I think that we would need a little bit of your support on that, and that could become part of this discussion that we should have soon, I would suggest, at a very near board meeting where we do some of this work and in a way that can make that change. The other thing to Rachel's point is, I do think as I reflect on the concept of sending it back to staff, what you could send back to staff is a request for the learning part. As I reflect on the last couple of months, sometimes the comments are made in a way that has, in my opinion, nothing to do explicitly with what we're talking about, even though there's a connection that may be made, which makes it difficult to shut that off or turn off a mic or what have you. So if we are going to do some staff work on it, for example, how we use pronouns, why we use pronouns in certain ways, what inclusion looks like, what steps we've taken in this space, that's a great learning tool. Whether people will make a direct connection or not to the difficult comment that might have offended people, we can't control that. But I think Rachel's last point is important, that in light of how sometimes, I'll speak for myself, the comments can be so jarring that it's almost determining how to respond, when to respond. And Rachel's point is a good one. You know, 4 of us respond, me and 3 trustees, but 2 others were going to respond. But then it gets a little bit, unfortunately, as you said, Rachel, very convoluted. So I think that we should build in, not to make things so formal, because you always have a right in your report, that trustee report at the end, where you can share whatever you feel you want to share, always within appropriate bounds and laws and all the rest. But I think to this point around how that introduction is used, how that introduction is reminded, because we can use it again, and how we close with that introduction, it's never a problem. That was a weird way of saying close with an introduction, but you get my point. It's making clear what the board and the district stand for. So Harold, maybe you can give some thought to that. You and I can talk. And then when we bring this forward, maybe to the next board meeting with a couple of other ideas that are emerging, we can have it all together at that point. That's just a few thoughts from my perspective. Sorry that I was thinking out loud as I was trying to pull it together.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. And, you know, one of the things, I know that there was a comment previously that there's a historical memory in the district that at some point in San Ramon Valley, there was a statement like that. And what I can do while you look at your end is I can see if we've got good examples from other districts, because this is one of those areas where I cut from whole cloth when there's examples that are out there that you might be able to build from, so we can try to track those down.
Okay. And I just think it would be important for whatever the statement is, to whichever one of us gets it together to respond, is responding on behalf of all of us about our shared values. And so it doesn't end up having to be this Me Too thing and why didn't you Me Too and all that. That's where process would be taking over from substance.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. The other thing that I've seen done, which I like, is when you have a statement like that, rather than having the board president read it, I do work with some districts where they rotate, and each board meeting, a different board member reads it, which cements in the public's mind, this is the view of the whole board. This just isn't one alone. So something to at least think about. Okay, I am going to advance. Oh yeah.
I wanted to comment. I like that partly because of the fact that at times it seems like Susanna is the target, and then she's the one that is the lead saying that, which doesn't really show our support in a way that I think would be effective. So
great. Great. Well, I am going to advance to the next slide because I'm determined to get to the Public Records Act and our ethics pieces. I went into this on the assumption we'd spend most of our time talking about your board meetings. This is going to be a little bit back to some nuts and bolts. And really my intention is just to give you the big picture. Some of these slides I'll go through very briefly because it's really there more for you to take away with you. But if we can go to the next slide, on the Public Records Act basics, here's the important things to know about the Public Records Act. The Public Records Act is found in the Government Code, section 6250 et sec, so 6250 and the following sections. It is worthy of going and reading it sometime if you're ever unable to sleep at night. Not incredibly long set of laws, and a lot of them you can just tell immediately are not applicable to you because they're specific to police records, for example. You can read it pretty quickly. When you read it, it's a little bit shocking because what it says is that, and this is a fundamental right in California, it's a constitutionally protected right, that all of districts' records are open to inspection, absent a statutory exemption. That includes emails, texts. If there's a way of recording it, it's included. So literally what the Public Records Act says is anybody could show up at John's office tomorrow and demand to see records. Fortunately, the Public Records Act also builds in that there's a certain amount of time for you to respond and it's not immediately turned over, but basically everything is public, which means that the basic rule is always going to be, if you don't want to see it in the newspaper, don't put it in writing. It's the same rule as it was 50 years ago before the internet. We go to the next slide. Public records are defined incredibly broadly. So it's anything that's in writing. And the key words here are that it's records that have been prepared, owned, used, or retained by the local agency. So if you put it together, if you received it, if you had a right to own it at any point, if you used it at any point, it's a public record. And that's regardless of physical form or characteristics. If it's recorded in any way, the statute lists, magnetically. I mean, if there's a way to record it, it's covered. So this is incredibly broad. So we can go to the next slide. This is just a list of all the different things that you can think about that are public records: faxes, digital storage, electronic mail, drafts of things can be, if they're still retained in the district systems, can still be a public record. So it's incredibly broad. When the public asks for a record, generally speaking, you have 10 days to respond. Sometimes if it's an obvious record that's sitting in front of you, the court will not necessarily allow you the full 10 days. But you have 10 days to respond to say, yes, we're going to produce records or we're not. And then at a reasonable amount of time thereafter to produce the records. And I will just tell you right now that we are spending more time as a law firm on Public Records Act issues than any other issue other than school reopening or closure. There have just been floods of extremely detailed, difficult Public Records Act requests. We work with a district that is looking at putting lighting on one of its play fields. And there is a neighborhood group that's very opposed to it. And they, in the course of the last now almost 2 years, have submitted over 50 separate Public Records Act requests. And the district has produced well over 25, I think it's 25,000 pages of documents. And every week they get a new Public Records Act request. So this is heavy time commitment for you, your staff. And again, something you really do need to be aware of as a board member. Now, there are some exceptions, if we can go to the next slide, just to be aware of. And these aren't all of them, but there's some of the ones that are listed. There's certain things you don't have to provide. I have here preliminary drafts and notes. Unfortunately, it's more limited than that. It's preliminary drafts or notes that are not ordinarily retained in the normal course of business. So if it's still sitting in the district system somewhere, it's being retained in the normal course of business. It's probably still got to be produced. Attorney-client privilege documents, particularly pending the litigation, are going to be protected. Certain personnel and medical files are going to be protected. I love this one. They added it to the Public Records Act years ago. Test questions and answers and exam data is not a public record. I'm convinced that got added because some clever high school student made a Public Records Act request for their teachers' exams in the past. Other records that are prohibited from disclosure by federal and state law. So certain types of documents that are out there. And then there's an exception. You don't have to provide employee home addresses and telephone numbers. We go to the next slide. There is this catch-all exception that is found in Government Code Section 6255. It's a really tricky one. What it says basically is that if there is more compelling public interest in non-disclosure than there is in disclosure, you don't have to produce the document. So the district has to go through a weighing of, is the public going to be harmed by releasing the information? The old example we used, I can't use anymore because the legislature changed it. The old example was your school safety plans. You don't want the bad guys to see what your school safety plans say. You don't want to have the terrorists see, for example, how you're going to evacuate students in the event of a terrorist attack. We got helped by that in the Public Records Act in more recent years because that was added as a category that you don't have to produce. Student records are protected by federal law, generally don't have to be produced, student disciplinary records in particular. But all of this takes me to the next slide, which is the big one I want to focus on with you. Oh, and that's just another point to make. If you voluntarily produce records, generally you waive the exemption that's there. So for example, if the district has thousands of pages of attorney-client privileged information, they're requested by a member of the public, and the district knowingly produces them, you've probably waived your attorney-client privilege. There is some case law that says if you accidentally release them and you immediately ask for them back, you haven't waived the exemption. But you want to be really careful with that as well. Now we can go to the slide where I get to talk about the City of San Jose case. So this is my favorite case, I think, that was ever decided since I've been a school lawyer, because it was one of those questions we just didn't have an answer to. And this California Supreme Court finally gave us an answer, which is awesome. So what happened in this case, every case, there's a story. Remember, I told you that. There was a gentleman who liked to make requests, public records requests of the City of San Jose. And one day he made requests in relation to a particular redevelopment project for all documents and communications between officials within the city, inclusive of their emails and inclusive of emails sent to and from their personal accounts or on personal devices. And the city said, well, you can have all of that, but we're not going to give you stuff from personal devices and from personal accounts. And the person was unhappy. He sued. He actually won in trial court, and trial court said, yep, you've got to produce these, because if it's a business record, if it was used by, retained by, et cetera, the public agency, it's a public record, you got to produce it. Went to the appellate court, which reversed the decision of the trial court and said, no, it's not a public record. The legislature didn't clearly say it was. And then it went to the California Supreme Court. And if we can go to the next slide, They gave an answer. They gave a definitive answer. Here we hold that when a city employee uses a personal account to communicate about the conduct of public business, the writings may be subject to disclosure under the California Public Records Act. So take out the word employee and city. This applies to all local agencies, including school districts, and it applies equally to school board members as employees. What the court basically said is if you're using your personal account or your personal device to communicate on district business, that is generally going to be a public record. That was a bombshell when the case got decided in 2017, because people were all over the place in the state on this. And the California Supreme Court's decision was unanimous. It was short, and it was written in sound bites that could be quoted in the newspaper, because it was the rare case where the court decided they wanted to settle this issue forever. They made it as clear as they can. So now when you are, as a board member, communicating with a member of the public about an issue that is within the district's jurisdiction, if there's a Public Records Act request for those materials, you may have to provide them, which is a very intimidating, difficult thought. And we get into all sorts of problems with it. If we go to the next slide, there is a little clarification that the court gave, which is that the record actually has to relate in a substantive way to the public's business. And that if it's primarily personal in nature, it doesn't. And the court gave an example. And this is why this is my favorite case ever, because you don't see courts do this. They wanted to make it have no doubt. So they used the example that if somebody says, my coworker is an idiot, this is the California Supreme Court using the word idiot. If my coworker is an idiot, if you have that in there and you send that message, for example, to your spouse, that's not going to be a public record you have to produce. It's not a substantive relation to the conduct of public's business. But the court went on to say, conversely, an email to a superior reporting the coworker's mismanagement of an agency project might well be a public record. So that's what we're left with, is if you're really getting into the substance of something, it may be a public record. That's why you want to be mindful when you're communicating with the public. I have my prop that I use. I can send texts and emails on this device. It's a phone, but I can also call people on it, and that's not a public record. And so if you want to have a frank discussion with somebody, sometimes you might want to think about not putting it in writing, which is why the next slide says what it says, which is don't put it in writing if you don't want it in the newspaper. And that's the big case that I wanted as a takeaway for you. I'll just also briefly mention, if we go to the next slide, there used to be an assumption in California that personnel records were exempt under the Public Records Act. And under the cases that are mentioned here, they're not exempt. They're not automatically exempt. If there's an allegation that is a substantial allegation and there's any reasonable cause to believe in it, and it's a matter of public concern, the documents have to be released. So the classic example is a teacher in the district is accused of molestation. The thought used to be before these cases came down, well, that's not a public record because it's not, it's in the personnel file, it's a personal matter. And the courts have changed that and say, well, in that case, the public has a right to know, did the district discipline the teacher over this alleged allegation? Did they investigate the teacher? What does the record have to say? Which led us to the next case on the next page, which is the Markin case. This is a really interesting case. Every case has a story. I've said that I think 3 times today. In the Markin case, you had a particular teacher who was accused of some stuff that he vehemently disagreed with. And this was not the superintendent of the district in BRB and Bakersfield, these other cases, they were high-ranking officials. This was a rank and file, I think it was a math teacher, if memory serves. There was a request for his personnel record. And what came out of this case was the court said what the school district could do in that instance is tell the teacher, look, we're not going to make the decision whether or not to produce the records. We're going to just produce them unless you go to court and get a restraining order to stop us from doing it. It's called a reverse PRA action. And so it gets really complicated when we get to these requests for personnel records because do you want to produce them? Don't you? If you do want to produce them, do you give notice to the employee? And in a recent case that came down, I think it was just last year out of San Diego, a public agency decided that they were going to withhold the records because the employee asked, it was really a consultant in that case. They withheld the records. this reverse PRA action happened, the court ordered that the records be produced and then actually made the public agency pay $25,000 towards the attorney's fees of the plaintiff, even though all they were doing was sitting on the sidelines saying, we're going to let the court figure it out. So all of this is to say, it is no longer the case that it's an automatic that personnel records are not public records. And if a request for one comes in, it's really complicated. So that was my 13-minute overview of the Public Records Act. The big takeaways in it, the three big takeaways that I wanted to focus on. First of all, is this issue of if you put it in writing, it may be a public record, so be careful about it. Secondly, that your personal emails and personal devices may be included in a Public Records Act request. So again, you want to be really mindful about that. Personally, I like when board members only use their official email, district email, when communicating on any district-related business, because then the easy answer for the board member, if there's a Public Records Act request, is the district has everything I have. They have access to my records, and you don't have to go home and spend time searching your personal computer. And I have had the sad experience, not once, but twice in my career, of having to stand there while a sheriff or other law enforcement officer walks in with a warrant and walks out with somebody's computer. It is a painful and horrible moment. And both of them were related to Public Records Act and Brown Act issues. And it's a whole lot easier if you can just say, the district has everything that I have. So I know that's a quick brain dump. The focus has never been for today on the Public Records Act, but I wanted to call your attention to the big issues. Are there any questions on, I know I've probably raised more questions than I've answered, but anything anybody wants to bring up?
Harold, I've got two. First is pretty much a clear assumption, but when we talk about public records requests for employee data, the same does not hold true for like student disciplinary information.
Correct. Student data is all governed by federal law. It's not a state law issue. So the California courts and legislature can't override the federal law, FERPA. And so that all remains protected. Employee issues are very different.
Okay, that's what I thought. The other point is, you know, I understand the limitations of attorney-client privilege type information. And once that gets let out, just like talking about voluntary exposure of or disclosure kind of takes that away. In my business experience, you know, we had information that was labeled as confidential or proprietary, and we had rules relative to, you know, different levels of security of data. Do we have anything like that beyond attorney-client privilege type secure data?
Yeah, you know, there's nothing official in California. I mean, there's attorney-client privilege, there's the federal law on student data. Superintendents will often send something that is marked confidential. And if there's a Public Records Act request, we will look very closely at that because there are all these other exceptions under the Public Records Act about what you have to produce. So for example, if there's a confidential memo that goes to the board about an accident that happened at a school site, we may conclude that that is protected because it's prepared for an attorney, for example. But there's not a classification the way there is in the business world. The general rule we say is if there's a belief it's confidential for some reason or another, put the word confidential in big letters on it. Mm-hmm. And then if you have to, let the lawyers figure out later whether that's defensible. We do often recommend that when communications are sent to the board, we worked with one district that used to just send everything in a clump of here's the confidential and the non-confidential. There was extensive Public Records Act requests. We had to go back for years and dig into every one of those and figure out which of these were related to closed session items, which were open, which was attorney, which wasn't. And so the district changed its practice to actually send out two separate mailings to the board. There was the confidential Friday packet, and there was the here's the generally available to the world packet. And that way, when records requests came in the future, we didn't even have to try to figure out which the district thought was confidential. We could produce everything that was marked not confidential and just focus on those things that were confidential.
Okay, and then one subset of that question then is the confidentiality of closed session discussions. And how and when can those be made available or disclosed or have to be disclosed?
Yeah, generally under the Brown Act, closed session discussions are and remain confidential. There are some things that you will discuss in closed session that become not confidential after everything is done. So for example, if you have a draft of a settlement agreement with an employee or a draft of a property sale agreement or purchase agreement, it's going to be confidential when it goes to the board because it's in draft form. But once both sides sign it, it's going to become a public record for the most part. And so everything until the end of that item that was discussed in closed session remains confidential. After the item is done and closed out, there may be some things that later become public. All of the discussion in the closed session remains confidential. So the not documents, but the words that were said in closed session, that is confidential. It remains confidential. There are very rare exceptions where you can get into that. One of them is if there's an allegation that is sustained that there was a Brown Act violation that occurred in the closed session. A district attorney may be able to interview board members or depose them and ask them about what was said in the closed session. But the general rule is it's confidential unless one of these narrow exceptions apply.
Okay, and just one other aspect of closed session, not that I worry about with our board, but any consequence for sharing information out of a closed session.
Yeah, well, if you share information out of closed session under the Brown Act, there's a number of consequences. You can be enjoined in court from doing so again. You can be censured by the board. And if there's any indication that it was done for any pecuniary gain, any personal financial profit motive, for example, of the board member, that's actually a crime under the Brown Act. And so I think I talked to you about last time, you know, confidential means confidential. You're not telling your spouse, you're not telling your priest, you're not telling your rabbi. It is just amongst the people that were in that closed session. And there are absolute consequences from releasing that information.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm going to wrap up with a few words on ethics before I let you all go. We can go to the next slide. So one of the things that you get training along the way on is these basic rules of ethics. I've got 10 minutes. I'd hope to have about 15, so I'm actually not that far behind where I want it to be. To just kind of give you a brief overview. The slides here have more detail, and I'll refer you to the slides at your convenience to take a look at these different rules as you know, as time allows as you go. And there are times in these that I actually put in more citations than I did elsewhere, knowing that we would spend less time on the section. I also know we'll spend less time on the section because this is one of the rare areas of the law where common sense usually prevails. If it looks bad, don't do it. If it creates an impression that it's bad, don't do it. And the laws are just all a complex set of discussion of those basic concepts. So we go to the next slide. You know, the basic principle is you're not supposed to be not just financially benefiting, but you're not supposed to be benefiting generally from your role as a board member. It's not supposed to give you personal gains, family gains, and the penalties are significant depending on the kind of violation. And I list them here for a reason. They're scary, and they should be. You can be thrown out of office. You can be prohibited from holding public office again. You can be sent to jail. You can be fined. You can have to pay attorney's fees. And certainly the whole thing can be incredibly embarrassing. Most of the instances of violations of ethic rules I've been involved with for clients have been very minor technical infractions where mostly the consequence is paying a fine that's sometimes as little as $25 or $75 and having your name in the newspaper, which is rather embarrassing, which is why you want to stay on top of these technical rules. And of course, if you don't put yourself in compromising situations, you don't have to worry about it as much. So we go to the next slide. There's really three different bodies of law that you have to worry about when it comes to all of this. And I'm going to very briefly point you to them. The Political Reform Act, Government Code Section 1090, which is the really scary one, and common law conflicts of interest. And I'm going to take you through each one briefly. So if we can go to the next slide for the Political Reform Act. I want to just pause here for a moment. I always note that it's the Political Reform Act of 1974. The reason it's the Political Reform Act of 1974 is that something called Watergate had happened. And there was a tremendous amount of attention in the legislature about making government more transparent and limiting people's conflicts of interest. So this set of rules comes straight out of the lessons learned in Watergate and the desire for better government service. So the basic rule, as you see it there, is that you can't engage in an activity if you are financially interested in that activity. And there's 1,000 rules that I'm not going to take you through that define that, but I at least want to point you to where to find them. So on the next page, you'll see that public officials are supposed to, and this is straight out of the Political Reform Act, are supposed to act free of bias. That's the common sense thing to take away from this. If you give any reason for people to believe you're biased in an action you've taken, there's potentially going to be consequences for you. There's potentially going to be political embroiling of the situation. So if you go to the next page, in the case of the Political Reform Act, there's this body, the Fair Political Practices Commission, or the FPPC, that most of you have probably heard of. You've all filled out a Form 700. That's the entity that is sort of the grandfather of the Form 700, where you disclose any potential conflicts with stock ownership and the like. They enforce the Political Reform Act. And the main thing I want to emphasize here is that they are available for advice. And I made a terrible typo that I'm seeing right now at the bottom of the page. It's not 1-800-ASK-FPPC. It's 1-866-ASK-FPPC. 1-866-ASK-FPPC. If you're not sure whether there's something you can do or not, you can actually call the FPPC and ask either for an informal advisory opinion, or if you want to rely on it, a written opinion from them. That will take longer. If you get a written opinion from them and you act based on it, you cannot be held liable for violation of the Political Reform Act. And so this is a tremendous resource. I call the FPPC on a not irregular basis to get their take on issues we're asked to research. It's free advice. It's just sitting there waiting for you. And so I encourage people, if in doubt, to reach out to the FPPC and ask the question. Be forewarned, they don't always have the answer, but quite frequently they do have an answer they can give you. If we go to the next page, I'm not going to take you through this test. I just want to make you aware of it. The question under the FPPC is always going to be, under the Political Reform Act, is always going to be, is there going to be a foreseeable material effect on you? And there used to be an 8-part test that the Political Reform Act laid out. Now they've reduced it to a 4-point test. Really, it all comes down to, is it reasonably foreseeable that you're going to be affecting yourself by making a decision? And just to illustrate, 2 nights ago, I think it was 2 nights ago or it must have been last week, it was Friday, the San Jose City Council was meeting, and they were discussing something that had an influence on deciding a contract that some vendor that did business with or was a subsidiary of Amazon. And it wasn't until midway through the meeting that 2 board members went, oh wait, I own Amazon stock. That's a question you want to ask yourself before the meeting. They made the front page of the San Jose Mercury News. Everybody made a big deal of it. One of the board or city council members owned 1 share of Amazon stock, which, by the way Amazon stock's going, 1 share is worth about $1,300. But still, those are the things that you want to look at in advance. And there's a host of rules, if we go to the next slide, of different kinds of economic interests you have to think of. Again, I have this for you in writing, so I don't have to go through it all, and I hope you'll take it away. Key ones to know about are, do you have a business entity that you're part of that's doing business with the public agency? That should set off an alarm for you. Do you own real property in the vicinity of a project, district project that may be affected one way or the other? Do you have a source of income that you're going to be making a decision about where you or your spouse earn more than $500 a year off of it? The big one is the gifts one. The amount goes up. It just went up to $520. That's for the next 2 years, from $500. Are people giving you gifts that are worth more than $520 in a 1-year period? The good news is that doesn't include family, birthday presents, wedding presents, etc. This is vendors taking you to lunch, taking you to dinner. And as most of you know, if that gift you get is worth more than $50, you have to report it to the FPPC. If it's under $50, it's okay, as long as you don't go over $520 total in a year. And then this just general concept again, and will it have a personal financial effect on you or your immediate family? We can go to the next slide. What happens if you are disqualified under these rules. Well, you're not supposed to participate in the decision. That doesn't mean waiting until the night of the board meeting to abstain. You're not involving yourself in it leading up to the board meeting at all. You don't try to discuss it with your colleagues or influence them. At the board meeting, you identify your conflict. I own Amazon stock, and therefore I'm going to recuse myself from this. Interestingly, your board bylaw 9270 says that at that point you can stay at the dais with the rest of the board. You don't step down from the dais. I work with other districts that their policy says you actually leave the room so that there can be no undue influence. So something to think about for the future. Nothing wrong with doing it this way. As a board member, I think I'd feel uncomfortable if I just announced I had a conflict, staying in the front of the room or on camera. And I think I would personally still choose to leave the room until the discussion's done. And then you're not allowed access, obviously, to any closed session discussion on any of this. So the next slide, what happens if you violate these rules? Here's the list of bad things that we talked about earlier. Be aware that there are misdemeanor violations. You can be removed from office. And the fines of $5,000 to $10,000 per violation can be really significant. Now, I've had a situation where a number of our districts, and I don't know if this affected your district, they would go to the California School Boards Association dinners that at the annual conference that were put on by various vendors, and they'd be taken to very nice dinners. And almost always we would be given more than $50 worth of food or wine, and then wouldn't be given a receipt and wouldn't declare it. And the FPPC cracked down on that and sent out, I think, a total of upwards of 300 different individual violation letters to chief business officials, superintendents, school board members around the state, and generally fined them about $75 each, which doesn't sound that bad, but then the newspapers got a hold of it and ran the list of here's every public official in California who violated that and was fined by the FPPC. Didn't mention it was only a $75 fine. So if you're being given a gift, if you're being taken to dinner, it's okay to ask what's being spent on you. If you ever go to our reception at CSBA for Lozano Smith, which hopefully someday we will have a reception again because hopefully we'll have a live conference, you can rest guaranteed we will not give you more than $50 worth of food. And people give us a hard time because there's a certain point where we close the bar and we take away the food. And that is actually because we've determined by the head count in the room and the amount we've spent that we're exceeding $50 or we're getting to that number. So you want to be very careful about these things. We go to the next slide. I'm going to talk to you just really briefly about Section 1090, really complex area of law that we're not going to delve into deeply. The main thing is that Section 1090 of the Government Code says you can't enter into a contract with yourself. And by the way, your spouse, it's a community property state, counts as yourself. So you can't have the district do business with a business that you are a significant owner of. The famous case of this involved Bill Honig. You all remember Bill Honig, former state superintendent? And there's a case by the name of People versus Bill Honig. You never want a lawsuit against you to start with People because it means that you've been prosecuted criminally. He diverted work from the state to a tutoring company run by his wife. And ultimately it was about a $60,000 contract. He had to forfeit the contract. He had to return the money. He had to give up his office, and he was never allowed to run for office again in the state of California. And he pled no contest to the criminal charge against him. I don't think he actually did jail time, but it was that close to the state superintendent of schools doing jail time. The rule of Section 1090, this is different than the Political Reform Act. It's much narrower. Can't do contracts with yourself. And if there's a 1090 conflict, the board member cannot abstain. It means the board actually can't enter into the contract at all. And so these are what I refer to as the nuclear conflicts of interest. They completely void the contract that's involved, and the district can't enter into them at all. There's some exceptions if we can go to the next slide. And I'm just going to run you through these briefly because I know we're coming to our close here. Oh, there we go. There are these exceptions called remote interests where you can actually abstain because the interest is so minor. If you go to the next slide, there's a lot of words on the page I'm not going to go through. These are just examples of the 17 different categories of remote financial interests. Yikes. I mean, it's complex, difficult stuff that looks at how long you've been doing business with the district and what percentage of contracts you own. You go to the next slide. There's also statutory non-interests that are described where actually you don't have to recuse yourself and you can still vote. And we go to the next slide. Bunch of words on the page I'll let you read later. A lot of different examples, 14 different categories in all in the statutes. So this is complicated stuff, right? What do you do if you think you have a conflict of interest under Government Code Section 1090? Well, you can call the FPPC. Until a couple years ago, they only advised on Political Reform Act. Now they'll advise you on 1090 as well. But here's a scary thing. Let's say you have a 1090 problem, or you might have one. You go to the superintendent, you say, I think I may have a 1090 problem, but I'm not sure. And the superintendent says, well, I'll ask Harold and I'll get an opinion from Harold. What the courts have said is you're not entitled to rely on the advice of the school district's attorney. You have to get your own legal advice if you want to rely on it. It doesn't mean that it's not worth asking, but you actually have to go out and get your own advice. There's a famous case where there was a Section 1090 violation. The city council member relied on a written opinion by the city attorney that there was no 1090 violation. And the court said that he was not entitled to rely on that and was still liable under the violation. So 1090 stuff is really complicated. We can go to the next slide. There's this narrow exception just to mention the rule of necessity. Just be aware if there's ever something the board has to take action on, you have no choice. You have to take action on it. And 3 of your board members are conflicted out. You can actually draw straws or draw high cards, and one of the conflicted board members gets to unconflict themselves to be able to vote on the contract. Again, 27 years of doing this, I've only had that happen once and had the oddity of actually drawing straws to see who was going to be the person who got to vote. And then the last category of conflicts of interest on the next page is, consequences of the violation we talked about. Bad things happen, in short. Now if we go to the next slide. There's also this common law conflict of interest. This is the one that scares me in some ways the most because there's no law on it. There's no statute on it. What it says is that if you do something that has an appearance of impropriety, somebody can go to court and say, I think that was improper. And the way you find out whether it was improper or not is you wait for a judge to decide whether it was improper or not. You can't call the FPPC and ask about these because common law means decided by a court, which means that even if you didn't fall into any of the categories I just mentioned for conflicts of interest, you may still need to recuse yourself if there's something that just looks inappropriate, that may look bad as a whole. We can go to the next slide. Just so you know, you do have a board bylaw on this, that you're going to maintain the highest ethical standards and assure that decisions are made in the best interest of the district and the public. And it talks a lot about disclosing your conflicts and abstaining. That's separate and aside from the Political Reform Act and Government Code Section 1090. That's your own rules that you've imposed on yourself. And then just the last few slides to make you aware of, and then I'll let you ask any final questions. Gifts and perks, be aware. You're not supposed to be using your office to get special perks or gifts. That can range to a variety of things, free parking. One of the things that's come up recently is getting in line ahead of where you're supposed to be for the vaccine for COVID. It's because you're doing it and you get it because you're a board member. That's a perk. So you got to make sure that you're keeping your place in line. Next slide, the main point here is that be aware that not all gifts have bows on them. So you'll get invited, for example, hey, you're a board member. We want to show the district this great program we have. We'd like to fly you to Texas and put you up in a hotel for 3 days to learn about our special program. Well, that may be a gift that's going to be a problem for you. So if in doubt, you go to the superintendent and you let them know that this offer came in. And gifts if you give yourself, that's going into the district office and using the photocopier because you're a board member when members of the public aren't allowed to. You're supposed to only get access to the same extent as others, unless it's board business. That's different. Next slide. So there are these disqualifying interests. Actually, we already talked about some of these and the exceptions that are there. But if we go to the next slide, just a couple things to make you aware of. One is the Form 700s you're all aware of. You've all had to fill them out before. Just notes about when they are done. They're next due April 1st. And they usually go to the clerk of the board. So it usually flows through the superintendent's office. So be aware you'll have to update yours soon. And then the next slide. really close to being done here. This is something that most people don't know. Most school board members don't know. And I want the opportunity to tell you that this rule exists. There is in the Political Reform Act this concept of behested payments. A behested payment is when you ask somebody to make a donation to something and they do so, and it's over $5,000. If they do that, and it was for a charitable purpose or legislative purpose, lobbying, for example, or governmental purpose, you are supposed to fill out a form. I can't remember the form number right now. It's not 700, it's another number that you submit to the FPPC to tell them this. The reason I'm emphasizing this is I've worked with a lot of school boards where board members volunteered their time on bond measure campaigns and called businesses asking for donations to the bond measure campaign, and often elicit donations of more than $5,000 and do not file this form with the state and don't find out that they were supposed to until the state comes after them, the FPPC comes after them. So I want to imprint that on you, that if you're doing fundraising for the district and more than $5,000 comes in, you probably are going to have to disclose that to the state. So just something for you to bear in mind. The next slide. These are just some different resources I want to make you aware of as questions come up about conflicts of interest. We talked about the FPPC. There's great materials that the Institute of Local Government puts out. And the California Attorney General has a whole handbook on conflicts of interest that frankly we often go to as well. And then the last thought I'm going to leave you with, because I know we're running a little bit over, but we're just about done. If we go to the next slide. In addition to conflicts of interest, you've got to be aware that you have to remain impartial in your decision making. So for board members, if you have personal bias in different matters, it can raise problems. And I note the due process concerns. I'll give you an example. We worked with the school district where a popular football coach's son was accused of some pretty bad misconduct. And the district was going to be hearing an expulsion hearing. And a lot of the board members knew the coach. A lot of the board members talked to the coach. Some of them talked to the kid. Some of them talked to the witnesses. And by the time came for the board to have a hearing on the expulsion, it was really clear that all 5 board members had conflicted themselves out by getting involved in the decision making. The district actually had to hire a judge from the Office of Administrative Hearings to come in and neutrally hear the case, and ended up having to spend about an extra $25,000, $30,000 as a result of that. So you want to be really careful. If people come to you with issues, with problems, you listen, you report them as appropriate to the superintendent, but your job is not to be the investigator. You're not Nancy Drew. You want to remain impartial so when the issue comes to you, you're able to make decisions. And on the next slide, I've got just best practices that I mentioned. You know, don't talk to witnesses when you have these matters coming up. Don't do your own investigation. If you have a personal relationship, you may want to just recuse yourself altogether. This is my best friend's kid. This teacher is somebody I'm very friendly with, or is an old family friend or a cousin. Don't inject yourself into the process, and limit comments about district procedures or comments. You really want to refer things to staff when it comes to these kinds of issues. Then the next slide, which is the last substantive slide I'll leave you with. When you do get concerns, things to think about. If there's a concern about an employee, you should generally be going to the superintendent unless the superintendent directs you to an assistant superintendent. Shouldn't be going to the principal. You shouldn't be going to the employee. If it's about a cabinet level position, it's about an assistant superintendent, you want to talk to the superintendent. If it's about the superintendent, often it's good to talk to the board president, and sometimes, John, cover your ears, the board president may end up calling legal counsel to talk about the situation, depending how serious it is. If it's about a board member, you want to talk to the board president about that, but you have to be careful because you want to make sure you don't count to 3 board members who are discussing this. So there are times you have to go to the superintendent instead. And if it's about the board president, you may have to go to the superintendent. They may have to consult with legal counsel, or in an extreme case, you may have to bring it back to the whole board. Note that in none of these cases are the concerns you're reporting to a principal, you're reporting to a teacher, you're reporting to a parent. There is a process that you have to follow, that you have to go through. So I know I've gone about 10 minutes over. That's a really quick overview of the ethics issue. I'm happy to stick around as long as you need me to answer questions, but I know that we also need to start wrapping this up. So if there's questions, happy to take any.
Are there any questions for Harold at this time?
Hey, Harold, I'll just ask one quick question, particularly around those last few, items of talking to people. Is there anything like ex parte rules for school board? I've seen it with other local agencies where like planning commissioners won't talk to developers or something like that. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, I've seen that at the county board of education level more than at the school board level. So for example, Solano County, Santa Clara County are two that leap to mind, expressly require that if a county board member has had contact by anybody on any matter appearing in front of them, they have to disclose that to the full board at an open meeting. I've seen a few school districts that have rules along those lines. My general rule is for school districts, there's so many moving parts, it's kind of hard to have a hard and fast rule. Other than being aware, you've got, the typical school district has somewhere between 4 and 7 separate policy procedures for dealing with complaints. So if you're dealing with the complaint and you're hearing from the complainants, other than just listening and intake and giving it to the superintendent, for example, you probably already are violating one of the district's 4 to 7 different complaint procedures. But I haven't seen a lot at the school district level of, laying out, here's who you can talk to, here's who you can't, here's who you have to disclose. A lot of school board members will just individually say, when they're considering a matter, I did hear from the parent in this matter, I listened to them and referred the matter to the superintendent. So there's no surprises for anybody later.
So it sounds like really on things like appeals to just be real careful.
To be extremely careful. And if you're not sure if you can talk to somebody, it's okay to tell them, I'm not sure I can talk to you. I'm going to check with the superintendent. Because we have procedures and policies in place, I need to make sure that I'm not violating any of them by having this discussion with you, which, by the way, is a great way sometimes to help you gently get somebody to stop asking you the question. You get it backed up, and we've even written opinions before so that the district has an opinion of council letter expressly to be able to tell the person, I am forbidden from talking to you about this on advice of legal counsel.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be concerned about things like I said, either appeals or even bid openings. I'm not sure when someone comes to a school board member, but if you're talking about a large facilities project or something like that, something you probably want to be careful about.
Yeah, and that's something you could consider. We do have one district in Contra Costa County we worked with in their board governance handbook. There's a whole section on contact by vendors. When are you allowed to speak to vendors? When are you not allowed to speak to vendors? What are you supposed to do if you do speak to them? And that's certainly something, if the board's interested in, a governance handbook is something it could look at.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Any other questions for Harold? Okay, then at this time, actually, I need to ask for, do we have a public comment? Do we have public comments? Since this is actually public workshop.
No public comment.
Okay, thanks, Logan. Okay, then that's great. And thank you so much, Harold, for all the information. And no, this is all very important. And please, yes, if we can, as a board, kind of continue our work around this information as well as I would be very interested in a discussion with developing our own governance handbook, just to have really clear rules, procedures, because I think the Brown Act and everything else that we talked about in our first workshop is great, but there's not really a lot of practical, steps in how we manage and going through this. So I think that a governance handbook would be very, very helpful too. So
on that front, I will take that back as something that staff will work on in terms of some drafts, and then we'll bring it to formal board meetings. You can offer comments, offer additional direction, and we'll make a commitment over the next 2 meetings or so to work through that. We don't have to reinvent wheels. We've already started our work. Harold's already assisted us. There are many great models out there, but of course they need to be yours. So we'll start the process and connect with you on that shortly.
Okay, great. And with that, unless there's anything else, any other comments or questions, I think our workshop is adjourned. Okay, thanks.